My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Welcome to the Baab-Ul-Ilm Center in Leeds. In honor of Lady Zaynab's birth anniversary, we are hosting today's conference titled The Women of Ahlulbayt and Their Relevance in Today's Patriarchal Culture. Before we start the program, can I invite Brother Amir Dastmalchain to come and recite a passage from the Holy Quran. Can you please welcome him with an Nare Salvat? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت وإذا الصحف نشرت وإذا السماء كشطت وإذا الجحيم سعرت وإذا الجنة أزلفت علمت نفس ما أحضرت فلا أقسم بالخنس الجوار الكنس والليل إذا عسعس والصبح إذا تنفس إنه لقول رسول كريم ذي قوة عند ذي العرش مكين مطاع ثم أمين وما صاحبكم بمجنون ولقد رآه بالأفق المبين وما هو على الغيب بضنين وما هو بقول شيطان رجيم فأين تذهبون إن هو إلا ذكر للعالمين لمن شاء منكم أن يستقيم وما تشاءون إلا أن يشاء الله رب العالمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والمؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ويقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة ويطيعون الله ورسوله أولئك سيرحمهم الله إن الله عزيز حكيم. وعد الله المؤمنين والمؤمنات جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها ومساكن طيبة في جنات عدن ورضوان من الله أكبر ذلك هو الفوز العظيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Asantha, Brother Amir, for that beautiful recitation. Before we begin the program, I'd like to invite Sister, I should know this, Sister Sama Fatima to, I'll actually be killed because Summer is my niece. She's my sister's daughter, so just a temporary block there for a minute. So Summer will come and recite Hadith Kisa. Hadith Kisa is the narration of the clock, where the Prophet had invited his daughter, his son-in-law, and their children under a piece of a clock. So Summer, can you please come forward and narrate the story of this event? Please welcome her with salawat.
O Allah, send your blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. In the name of Allah, the All-Beneficent, the All-Merciful. Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon them, is to have thus related an event. My father, the Prophet of Allah, came to my house one day and said to me, "Peace be on you, Fatima." I replied, "And upon you be peace." Then he said, I feel weakness in my body." I said, "May Allah protect you from weakness, father." He said, "Fatima, please bring the Yemeni cloak and cover me with it." So I brought the Yemeni cloak and covered him with it. Then I looked at him and saw that his face was shining like a full moon with its glory and splendor. After a while, my son Hassan came in and said, "Peace be on you, mother." I replied, "And upon you be peace, O light of my eyes and the delight of my heart." He then said, "O mother, I smell a fragrance so sweet and so pure as that of my grandfather, the Prophet of Allah." I replied, "Yes, your grandfather is underneath the cloak." Hassan went near the cloak and said, "Peace be on you, my grandfather, the Prophet of Allah. May I enter the cloak with you?" He replied, "And upon you be peace, my son, and the master of my fountain. You are given the permission to enter." So Hassan entered the cloak with him. After a while, my Hussein came in and said, "Peace be on you, mother." I replied, "And upon you be peace, O light of my eyes and the delight of my heart." He then said, "O mother, I smell a fragrance so sweet and so pure as that of my grandfather, the Prophet of Allah." I replied, "Yes, your grandfather and your brother are underneath the cloak." Hussein stepped towards the cloak and said, "Peace be on you, my grandfather, the chosen of Allah. May I enter the cloak with you?" He replied, "And upon you be peace, my son, and interceder of my followers. You are given the permission to enter." So Hussein entered the cloak with them. After a while, Abu Hassan, Ali bin Abi Talib, came in and said, "Peace be on you, O daughter of the Prophet of Allah." I replied, "And upon you be peace, O father of Hassan and the commander of the faithful." He then said, "O Fatima, I smell a fragrance so sweet and so pure as that of my brother and my cousin, the Prophet of Allah." I replied, "Yes, he is underneath the cloak with your two sons." So Ali went near the cloak and said, "Peace be on you, Prophet of Allah. May I enter the cloak with you?" He replied, "And upon you be peace, my brother, my successor, and my standard bearer. You are given the permission to enter." So Ali entered the cloak with them. Then I stepped forward and said, "Peace be on you, my father, O Prophet of Allah. May I enter the cloak with you?" He replied, "And upon you be peace, my daughter, O part of myself. You are given the permission to enter." So I entered the cloak with them. Getting together underneath the cloak, my father, the Prophet of Allah, held the two ends of the cloak and raised his right hand towards the heavens and prayed, "O Allah, these are the people of my household, the Ahlulbayt. They are my confidants and my supporters. Their flesh is my flesh, and their blood is my blood. Whoever hurts them, hurts me too. Whoever displeases them, displeases me too. I am at war with those who are at war with them. I am at peace with those who are at peace with them. I am the enemy of their enemies. and I am the friend of their friends. They are from me, and I am from them. O Allah, bestow your blessings, benevolence, forgiveness, and your pleasure upon me and upon them, and keep them away from impurity, and keep them thoroughly purified. Then the Lord Almighty Allah said, O my angels, O residents of my heavens, verily I have not created the erected sky, the stretched earth, the illuminated moon, the bright sun, the rotating planets, the flowing seas, and the sailing ships, but for the love of these 5 underneath the cloak. Gabriel, the trusted angel, asked, Who are under the cloak? The Almighty answered, They are the household of the Prophet and the assets of prophethood. They are Fatima, her father, her husband, and her 2 sons. Gabriel said, O Lord, may I fly to earth to be the 6th of them? Allah replied, Yes, you are given the permission. Gabriel, the trusted, landed near them and said, Peace be on you, O Prophet of Allah. The All-Highest conveys his peace on you and his greetings, and says, By my honor and glory, O my angels, O residents of my heavens, verily I have not created the erected sky, the stretched earth, the illuminated moon, the bright sun, the rotating planets, the flowing seas, and the sailing ships, but for your sake and love. And Allah has given me permission to enter the cloak with you. May I join you, O Prophet of Allah? The Prophet replied, And peace be on you, O trusted bearer of Allah's revelations. You are granted the permission. So Gabriel entered the cloak with us, and said to my father, Allah sends his revelations to you. Verily, Allah's desire is to keep you away from impurity, O people of household, the Ahlulbayt, and keep you thoroughly purified. Then Ali said to my father, O Prophet of Allah, tell me, what significance has Allah given for getting together underneath this cloak? The Prophet replied, By him who rightfully appointed me a prophet, and chose me a messenger for the salvation of the mankind, whenever and wherever an assembly of our followers and friends mention this event, Allah will bestow on them his blessings and mercy. Angels will encircle them, asking Allah the remission of their sins until the assembly disperses. So Ali said, Verily, by the Lord of the Kaaba, we and our followers are the winners. Then my father replied, By him who rightfully appointed me a prophet, and chose me a messenger for the salvation of the mankind, whenever and wherever an assembly of followers and friends mention this event, there shall remain none grieved, but Allah will remove his grief. There shall remain none distressed, but Allah will dispel his distress. There shall remain none wish seeker, but Allah will grant his wish. Ali, peace be upon him, said, Then we have won and attained pleasure. I swear it by Allah, so have our adherents. They have won and attained pleasure in this world and in the hereafter. I swear it by the Lord of the Kaaba. O Allah, send your blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad.
Thank you, Sabah, for that beautiful recitation and blessing this event with that recitation. I'd like to welcome our panelists who've attended from London, Manchester, and virtually we'll have a sister, Daisy Khan, who will be joining us via Zoom a bit later on. So today's event, the program will be that we'll have a 15 minutes presentation by each of the panelists, and thereafter there'll be a Q&A interactive session where you guys can engage and ask your questions and put your questions to the panelist. The panelist that we have today is starting from my left, Sister Amina Inolos. Is that the way I pronounced your surname?
Yeah.
Perfect. Sister Amina is a researcher, an educator, public speaker, and a translator. She's the author of several books on Shiism. She holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Exeter, where she researched Shia hadith about pre-Islamic female figures mentioned in the Quran. Her 2015 PhD thesis is titled Negotiating Shia Identity and Orthodoxy Through Canonicizing Ideologies About Women in 12 Shia Hadiths on Pre-Islamic Sacred History in the Quran. She works for Islamic College as a researcher and also in the publication department, and she's the program lead for the MA Islamic Studies program. Welcome, sister. I think it's your first time in Leeds or
I was here once. It was several years ago, though.
in Baab, at the Baab?
No, it was somewhere else in Leeds.
In
Actually,
Leeds.
they had a program where they were showing the movie about Hazrat Maryam.
Okay.
A little bit of a similar theme.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, it's an honor to be here. Our second guest is Sheikh Ramadhan. Sheikh has been here previously. Sheikh is the chairman of the Ramadhan Foundation, a board member of the Center of Intra-Muslim Studies, SIMS, and advisor for the Markfield Institute of Higher Education's BA Islamic program. He has given lectures all over the world, has written numerous articles on the topic ranging from the Muslims' role in the West to interfaith and peaceful coexistence. His quest for the truth has taken him all over the world. Welcome, Sheikh, once again. We'll then have Daisy. She'll join us a bit later on. Daisy Khan is a campaigner, a reformer, and the executive director of Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, WISE, a woman-led organization committed to peace building, equality, and justice for women, for Muslims around the world. Daisy is a frequent media commentator on the US media platforms on topics such as Muslims' women's rights, Islam in America, Islamophobia, and violent extremism. Her memoir, Born with Wings, was published in April 2018. Daisy has consistently been recognized for her work. She was listed among the Times Magazine's 100 most influential people. The Huffington Post included her in the top 10 women faith leaders, and More magazine has described her as a link between moderate Islam and the West. Not sure what they mean by moderate Islam. I thought Islam was moderate. But that's a topic for another day. With that, can I welcome Sheikh for his presentation? Can you please welcome him with a Nari Salawat?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلي يا ربي على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Awaited Savior of Humanity, Imam Al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you all. Welcome to this brilliant program that the Baab-Ul-Ilm Center has organized. My discussion for a few minutes is to lay the foundation of the theory of how the Quran and the Sunnah, the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his noble family, set the trend for the eradication of misogyny, which I define as being either the hatred or the systematic exploitation of women. One of the things I'm trying to be able to demonstrate this afternoon is the Quranic vision for that. And so I will introduce a number of verses which show the method by which the Quran and the Sunnah sought to be able to push back and completely end these sorts of practices, and also to be able to build a bit of a picture as to what was going on in pre-Islamic Arabia, in pagan Arabia, as per the practices that were levied systematically against women. And then thirdly, I'm going to end with a theological question. And the question will be based around whether the revelation of these verses were intended to be the finality of the fight against misogynistic practices, or whether they were actually intended to be the beginning and an example of a framework by which we put an end to misogynistic practices. For if we imagine the Quran to be the finality of that, then everything that was accomplished and achieved in Arabia during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad was the end goal by which the Quran had set out its modus operandi of reform. Whereas if the Quran is actually laying the foundations, the seeds by which the eradication of hatred and manipulation of women was occurring, then actually these verses are far, far deeper and provide us with a framework by which we can continue to utilize until today. So I'm going to be presenting three things. First is a principle which demonstrates how whenever there is a type of hatred or a type of difficulty, Islam expects that the person in that situation goes above and beyond to be able to do goodness despite the difficulty of the situation in that moment, or despite the norms of practices and behaviors at that moment. That principle is known as Qa'idatul Ihsan, the principle of doing the utmost good, even to someone you dislike or in a very difficult situation for you. Then I'm going to show you a list of verses that demonstrate the types of misogynistic practices that were present in the time of Arabia, and then to show one particular verse that was revealed in response to this, and close with that question, whether these sorts of verses that pushed back against misogyny was meant to be the finality of practice, or actually sow the seeds of practice in human behavior. Adnan is going to show us a list of verses, and I know it might be a little bit small in terms of the writing, but I will read it and I will translate, and of course at the end when the panel gathers for any questions, if I can try to provide any further light on some of these verses, I will do my best, but in the knowledge that we have genuine scholars either side of me that will be able to expand on these verses far better than I can. The verse I start with is from chapter number 2 of the Quran, verse 229. In this verse, it is one of the verses that Allah reveals regarding how to deal with divorce, how to manage the tricky situation of divorce. Anyone who's either seen divorce or participated in divorce knows how tough it is on the participants and the extended family members and friends. For the most part, divorce can become a very tricky situation when there is a lot of enmity, a lot of kind of, built up anxieties, and everybody knows that sometimes this can boil over in the way in which people treat each other by virtue of how both parties may have seen their rights trampled upon, and so on and so forth. The verse introduces what is known as Qa'idatul Ihsan, the principle of doing utmost goodness and kindness to the opposite party, no matter the strain or difficulty that is placed between you. So Qa'idatul Ihsan can be expanded to any tense situation. If you have an opponent in war, you are still supposed to do good to them. If you have someone that you have fallen out with in business, irrespective, you still have to uphold their rights. Not only that, go as far as doing good to them in whatever dealings you have with them. Have a read of the verse with me, or at least the first part of the verse with me. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. At-talaqu marratan. Divorce should be pronounced twice. This is a legal issue about how to pronounce the divorce. We're not interested in this part of it. At-talaqu marratan. Divorce is to be pronounced twice. فَإِمْسَاكٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ أَوْ تَسْرِيحٌ بِإِحْسَانٍ. Then, before the finalization of the divorce takes place, either you may retain the divorce, you may keep them in goodness, or in what is known as a good practice amongst you, أَوْ تَسْرِيحٌ بِإِحْسَانٍ. Or if you decide to divorce, then let them go in ihsan, in utmost goodness. As I stated earlier, anyone who's been around divorce knows that it's a tense time, and there can be a lot of built up issues that are coming to the fore at that moment. Despite this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that if you've decided to divorce, end the divorce in a state of goodness. Now think about this question. Why should God have to capture this in revelation for all time and space? Do you imagine at that time when people were separating and going through divorce that men were treating women well, their soon-to-be ex-partners well? No. Of course, there was mudslinging, there was trying to, take away as many rights as possible, to not give what was due. In everything you could imagine, that when there's a power imbalance, especially 1400 years ago in Arabia, the way in which a man was treating a woman in the processes of divorce, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervened and said that if you decide to separate, do it in ihsan, with the utmost of goodness, to the extent of the person that you now see as your opponent, that you now see as someone who is causing strife against you. And of course this works both ways, men towards women, women towards men. Now just to show you how this works, there is a hadith of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and he expands upon this qa'idatul ihsan, the principle of doing goodness to someone no matter the difficulty of your situation. I'll read it to you in Arabic and then translate it. The hadith is as follows: Inna Allah kataba al-ihsana ala kulli shay. Allah, God, has ordained ihsan, the doing of utmost goodness, ala kulli shay, upon everything. In every situation, there is the expectation that the believer is to go out of their way to do ihsan, to do utmost goodness in everything, in every situation. Then the hadith expands and gives us one or two examples of how in the most difficult, treacherous, hardest of times, ihsan is expected. فَإِذَا قَتَلْتُمْ, if you're in a state of war, if you're fighting, فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَ, then you should do goodness in the way in which you are going to attack the enemy. Normally in a state of war, a person would put down all sort of care and consideration for their opponent. That's the purpose of war, defense and defeat. Even in this situation, if you're fighting, do so with the utmost care and kindness, goodness against your enemy. وَإِذَا ذَبَحْتُمْ, and if you are slaughtering an animal, if you're going to slaughter an animal for food, فَأَحْسِنُوا الذِّبْحَ, then even do so in the best of ways. Do so with ihsan, the most care and goodness that you can afford this creature. And this is why, as you know, in Islam, we have to have certain protocols to make a slaughter permissible for us to be able to eat, such as giving it water, taking permission of God to be able to slaughter this animal before we do so. Now, why have I started with this? Why have I introduced the topic of misogyny with qa'idatul ihsan, the principle of doing the utmost good to someone? In this verse, you can see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us that there were certain practices in Arabia, such as the divorces that people were going through, and this brought out the worst in human beings. It brought out their greed. It brought out their enmity. It was within them that all of these different anxieties and hatreds of the opposite party were present and allowed itself to manifest during this practice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded by telling men in particular here that if you are going through this practice, if you are going through divorce, the obligation upon you is to divorce in the very best of ways, by looking after your partner or ex-partner to be in the very best of ways. If you understand this, when you begin to actually see the amount of misogynistic practices, exploitative practices that were present in pre-Islamic Arabia, it is shocking to build up that picture. Brother Amir, when he came and recited the verses of the Quran at the very beginning, read some verses about how baby girls were systematically buried alive after birth. There was such a hatred for women that there was female infanticide. That when a man was given the glad tidings and the blessings of having a daughter born to him, his face would turn dark with rage, the Quran says. And this is a spiritual darkness, that the face was all light, all blessing was taken away from him. And in response, he would bury his baby girls alive. I want to show you a couple of verses to show you the extent of the practices that were there in Arabia. And believe me, I'm only going to show you one or two, and this is but a glimpse of what was occurring in Arabia. But if you see this, you will understand how both the Quran captured what was occurring at that time, but also how the Quran intervened on these practices at that time. So the next verse, we can skip the one. Yeah, good. It should be, which verse did I send you? Chapter 24? Yeah?
The next one is 65.
Can you go to the next one, please? Yeah, thank you very much. So the verse I'm going to show you is chapter number 24, Surah An-Nur of the Quran, the chapter of the light, verse number 33. I'll only read a part of the verse for the sake of brevity. But again, just to give you an image of the types of misogynistic, systematic practices in pre-Islamic Arabia, and how the Quran, when it was revealed, intervened in these misogynistic practices. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَلَا تُكْرِهُ فَتَيَاتِكُمْ عَلَى الْبِغَاءِ إِنْ أَرَدْنَا تَحَصُّنًا لِتَبْتَغُوا عَرَضَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. And do not compel your slave girls into prostitution when they desire chastity. It was a systematic practice in Arabia that men, God forbid, would prostitute out their own slaves in order to make money. In fact, other verses in Ahadith tell us that men of Arabia, when they used to gamble, instead of settling their gambling debts by paying off their debts with their own wealth, they would prostitute their own family members in order to pay off their gambling debts. This was a systematic practice. The Quran intervened. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam intervened on this practice, and as far as we can imagine, wiped this practice out, or at least were intolerant of this practice completely. An example. Next verse, which verse were we going to? Chapter number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 235. Thank you so much. It's not that I don't know, it's just I'm checking to see if you're paying attention at the moment. Okay? In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the principles of engagement and marriage. That if you're going to be speaking to a woman, and I'm specifically saying to a woman, meaning the addressee is men, if you're going to be speaking to a woman for the sake of marriage, how to ensure there is no manipulation of her. As you know, man wants to enjoy himself, and so if he's speaking to a woman, he may feel he can do so in such a way that allows him to be able to manipulate the situation for his own means and ends. Look at the verse. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. There is no blame on you if you wish to be able to speak to her indirectly, meaning getting a second party to speak on your behalf, ask questions, find out what the situation is. There is no blame on you speaking indirectly in asking a person for marriage, or keeping it concealed in your mind, speaking to someone, but you know in your mind you're genuinely having the conversation because you intend marriage, because you're trying to find out something legitimately about that person. Allah knows, God knows that you will genuinely bring out the mention and you will say that you're interested in marriage to them. But do not give them a promise in secret. Do not give them a promise in secret unless you speak to them in a permissible, lawful manner. Why do you think God would have to reveal this in Revelation, capture it in Revelation for all time and space? Unless men were doing the opposite that time. Speaking to women for a way of manipulation, having their own fun, and at the end of it, no intention of marriage, no care. So Allah intervened by saying, Allah knows what's truly in your minds. Therefore, if you're speaking to someone, I know I'm keeping a check on you. And do not give them a promise in secret. Yeah, we'll get married. No problem, we'll be together forever. It's the Romeo and Juliet story. You know, it's only us. DMing, as we say in today's age, the kids say, DMing everyone. Do not give them a promise in secret unless you speak in a lawful manner. The lawful manner is that you have your family members aware of what is going on. She has her family members aware of what is going on so that no manipulation takes place. There are a plethora of verses. I could probably show you maybe more than 20 verses of the Quran regarding the practices of misogyny, exploitation of women that was occurring at that time in pre-Islamic Arabia, and how every one of these verses put a stop to it. Returned dignity and rights to both parties in the way in which they interacted with each other. But I want to conclude with one last verse, and Adnan will kindly switch us to the last verse, which is chapter number 58. Thank you very much. It shows you that I'm ahead of the game, that I know what I'm talking about here. 58, verse number 1. Chapter number 58, verse number 1. And I'm going to show you an entire chapter revealed in the name of stopping misogyny and exploitation and hatred of women. And then I'm going to ask you this final question that I proposed to you at the beginning of the discussion. When the Quran revealed these sorts of verses, was this intended to be the finality of stopping misogyny? Or was this the example of the Quran setting a precedent and a framework of destroying misogyny? The chapter is 58. The chapter name is Al-Mujadala. Al-Mujadala means, loosely translated, the pleading one. And it refers to a woman who came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his immaculate family, pleading to the Prophet against a particular type of practice that was prevalent in pre-Islamic Arabia. What was that? A type of divorce known the Dhihar divorce. What was the Dhihar divorce? The Arabs used to have a type of divorce that if they proclaimed it, it would immediately cut ties with their wife by proclaiming that you are to me as my mother is to me. And the reason why they would use this type of divorce was in a state of hatred and anger, and they would say, you are like my mother to me. So I want nothing to do with you. I want give you nothing, and immediately we have no relationship. I treat you like my mother from now on. Now, according to some commentators, in the Arab custom, this type of divorce was created to show your hatred, your anger, your wrath against a woman. And it meant, according to some commentators, that the woman couldn't even get married again It completely dislodged her from anything social. Now at that time, a woman could not or did not generally have any rights, no independence. She could not own anything. She did not own any of her own wealth, generally speaking. She couldn't work. She had no independence. So if you divorced a woman in such a way, and then societally she could not marry again, this person is left completely on the sidelines of society to rot, to have nothing. And so of course would put her into so much difficulty in trying to regain some footing in society. Look at the verse. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله والله يسمع تحاوركما إن الله سميع بصير. Allah indeed knows the plea of her, this woman who is complaining about this dhihar type of divorce, who pleads with you, O Messenger of Allah Muhammad, who pleads with you about her husband and complains to God, and Allah knows the arguments between you both. Surely Allah is hearing and seeing. With this chapter, Allah intervened and stopped the practices of this dhihar type of divorce, and stopped men from having such practice and ease of being able to put a woman in such a difficult situation. The point I make is this. Every time in Arabia, there was a type of misogyny or exploitation of a woman, the Quran and the practice of the Prophet sought to intervene, and not just intervene, but present what was known as qa'idatul ihsan, to do the utmost good to the opposite party, no matter what your situation may be. Now I'm raising a question here, and this is a tough question for Muslims, let alone non-Muslims, to get their mind around. When God reveals revelation, and He reveals so many examples of intervention against women when they came and pled against the types of oppressions and exploitations against them, was this meant to be the ceiling? Was this meant to be the end of how we dealt with misogyny? Or was this demonstrating the types of misogyny in Arabia at that time and the principles and the framework of defeating misogyny? Let me reword the question. Is the Quran a book which is alive, or a book which is dead and stagnant from 1400 years ago? If it's dead and stagnant, then what occurred 1400 years ago is the end, the be-all and end-all of everything. And we don't need to do anything more, because the Prophet managed to end misogyny 1400 years ago. Whereas, as you know, misogyny sadly is alive and well. If the Quran is alive, if the Quran is for every time and space, then these are examples of defeating misogyny. Look at this verse again. وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. A woman came and complained of the misogyny against her, and immediately the religion intervened. There was an incident, there was a cause, and there was an effect. There was a response. Today we continue to have misogyny. Forgive me for my open words, but I speak openly for you to understand. Today, for example, it might be a woman, she's walking, and men are using their camera phones and taking pictures, what is known today as upskirt. Today, there are videos that are uploaded to websites of people having their relations as a way of revenge porn, whatever it may be. All of these and many, many more examples of misogynistic behavior. Allah yarhamak. Look at what the Quran said. When a woman complained of the exploitations against her, immediately the religion intervened. It was not stagnant, it was not silent, and it did not care for man's vested interest. It cared for the rights, the dignity, and the justice of women. This is the precedent of Islam, and anyone who suggests otherwise has not understood the role of the Quran, nor has understood the role of religion in redeeming the dignity and rights of people. This is how the Quran dealt with and intervened with misogyny, if we can understand the precedents that have stood the test of time, then we will be able to defeat much of the practices that are present here in front of us today. I hope this introduction was of benefit to you. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salli ya Rabbi ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.
Asante, Sheikh, for that enlightening presentation. While you were speaking and you were sort of highlighting some of those verses from the Quran, and the one, particularly the one where man used to sell their family, their women folks, to pay the debt, gambling debt. Food for a thought. That was happening 1400 years ago. In our society today, exploitation, sexualization of women is rampant. 1400 years ago, the women folk at the time may be powerless to stop that. What's interesting in today's society is that when you look at, for example, sexualization, you turn the TV on, you see it there. You turn the computer on your social media, it's there. You go outside, billboards, it's there. Yet, some people within our society feel it's empowerment. It's just a food for a thought. It's just something to reflect on. When you said that those words in the Quran are there for time and ever, it's perhaps at that time it was done under duress. I'm not sure, perhaps. But now I think it's becoming a stage whereby it's been sort of packaged under a heading of empowerment, and absolutely rebranded. You know, so that's something to reflect on. Perhaps we can take that point on at the Q&A. Before I introduce our next speaker, just like to mention a couple of people who've attended today. Hillary, Pippa, give us a wave. And Kaniz, thank you. You've come all the way from Dewsbury. Kaniz is a very busy lady, yet she's found some time to come today. Thank you so much, guys, for attending today's event. I wish some of our own members did that as well. With that, can I introduce Sister Amina Illinois, and she'll be speaking on the topic on are sacred women relevant in today's world? Please welcome Sister Bitnari Salvat.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to follow such a detailed and informative presentation. I do have to say what I appreciated the most, apart of course from the very solid Quranic references, was calling attention to something that I think we Muslims, for those of us who identify as Muslims, may have a problem with sometimes when discussing the perennial-ish subject of women in Islam. And that is sometimes there's such a push to emphasize how the situation of women improved at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and the improvements at that time, which, to be honest, in some things, like burying girls, it's a very clear improvement to stop it, but that we don't necessarily stop there. And certainly the Quran doesn't say, well, any improvement in society stops, after the time of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him and his family. But, certainly the prophetic ethos, part of his ethos was to come and reform society, not just for things to become static like that forever. So I think that's a good point that perhaps I might try to draw attention to. Okay. By the way, I think we have a PowerPoint. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فلما وضعتها قالت ربي إني وضعتها أنثى والله أعلم بما وضعت وليس الذكر كالأنثى وإني سميتها مريم وإني أعيذها بك وذريتها من الشيطان الرجيم. And when she gave birth, she said, "O Lord, I have delivered a girl." And God knows best what she delivered. And the male is not like the female. A phrase that gives you some thought. The male is not like the female, and I have named her Mary, and I entrust her to you and her descendants. I entrust them to you to protect them from shaitan, from Satan. Sadaqallah al-Ali al-Azim. We can have another salawat. So today we are going to be looking at the question of, are sacred women relevant to today's society? And the corollary of, why are we even asking that? I mean, do we sit here and ask, are men in sacred history relevant? I mean, yes, there are some people who are heavily secularized today, and they don't want anything to do with the spiritual or religious history of humankind. But in general, you don't ask a Muslim, is the Prophet Muhammad important? Or, you don't, is the Buddha important, etc. Men are generally considered to be important in the history of religion and spirituality and humanity. But for some reason, we need to have special gatherings for women. And alhamdulillah, I do see a few more respected males here than I did when I first came in. But a lot of times, once you say women in Islam, the men just disappear for some reason. Despite the fact, to be honest, and no offense intended, but sometimes perhaps some things are more important to discuss with the men. Because we women hear what we say to each other all the time, but sometimes we don't have communication. So I would like to look at that question, and I'm going to approach it from the angle of how we discuss, or sometimes do not discuss, women in sacred history in Islam. You may advance, by the way. Because I think that is one of the factors behind whether or not we consider certain people relevant. I'm going to mention something right now that I'm not sure within the Muslim community is always given much attention, and that is, we as human beings tend to frame the sacred figures in our tradition in the light of our culture and expectations. We see God in our own image, as it were. We are nowadays fairly familiar with this, with how it happens with the artistic portrayals of Jesus and some of the racial ramifications of that. That's why those pictures are up there. In fact, they go off the screen too. But the idea being, we understand that on the one hand, this may be a nice thing that we see the sacred as something which is very meaningful to us, but also it can go the wrong way if our portrayals, which are influenced by our expectations, our background, and frankly, when it comes to gender issues, I think it's early childhood, which is not always the same for everyone in any culture, but I suspect that the vast majority of our views about what, quote unquote, the roles of men or women are, and of course that's a very complicated phrase in this day and age with all of the broader categories we have, I suspect they're cemented very early from our experience, and we don't even realize that we're projecting them, myself included. But the point is, this then gets loaded onto how we discuss religious figures, and today we're going to be looking at female ones. So you can see the many cultures in the middle looking at the world. And I'm not going to argue today that one cultural view is right or wrong. I just want to call attention to the phenomenon, and then you can all use your your intellectual capacities to consider it in daily life if you don't already. So, next. We're going to look at 4 examples, inshallah. These are some portrayals of Fatima Zahra, peace be upon her, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, someone who's very prominent in the early Muslim community and among the companions of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Obviously a member of the household of the Prophet Muhammad, and given, one can say in a special respect in the mystical traditions of Islam, also in Shiism, she is considered infallible. There is the idea, which is not really validated hadith, but there is an idea which I think is reflective of the tradition, that Were it not for Fatima, God would not have created the cosmos. So there is this idea that there is a very deep spirituality in her, which is unparalleled, except with the Holy Prophet and Imam Ali, peace be upon them. And one of the ways we see this reflected in pictures of her is that she's never portrayed. And I'm, all for not, rarely portrayed anyway, traditionally not portrayed. I'm all for the not portrayal of the features of sacred figures in Islam. It is traditional, for example, when you draw the Holy Prophet, that you cover his face or you put a light or you do something, you obscure it, so you're not actually giving him features and a face and an image. And oftentimes other sacred figures will be drawn in the same way. Exceptions apply. We've seen some manuscripts that are otherwise, but it is a sign of respect. So on the one hand, when we're portraying Hazrat Fatima, one of the things that I think is subtly understood but maybe not verbalized is when we portray her in the chador or obscured or whatever, it's not that we're trying to erase her from existence, but it's the concept that sometimes the divine and spiritual power is so strong that it must be veiled. This is an idea that very subtly runs through most Muslim Islamicate cultures. For example, you have the Holy Kaaba, which is a central, obviously the center of Islamic spirituality, and the cover of the Kaaba is very important. Certainly in the Shi'i shrines, you have the inner sanctums and then the outer areas covering it. To be honest, I have not invented this idea. I know someone who makes this argument for samosas, and sambusas, that that the food inside was the value, so you covered it up with something. Anyway, it's a little bit of a weird argument, but it stays in the mind. But the point is, we have the concept of veils of Allah, and also, in my view, this type of portrayal is a veil of the deep spiritual power. I'm not saying she's Allah, but it is believed in some circles there is a deep connection there. Some people will argue that for the nature of the sacred feminine in general, but I guess maybe Daisy Khan is going to go more on that topic. So that can be a very beautiful portrayal, which I think is something which is very missing in today's secular society. There was some talk about objectification and so forth, and to some degree I think this question of sacred women and secular or modern society is a bit different if you're talking to a religious community which has an interest in maintaining its religion in a secular society versus people who just don't really care about that. I'm just going to kind of add a couple words on that. And I know this is, a mature topic, but we're all mature or else at an age where we're not going to get it. So, I'm just going to observe that as a, someone who was not born and bred in the UK, I was quite taken aback by some of the billboards and advertisements and so forth here. And some of the jokes and humor about, with apologies, sexual manners and, sometimes very explicit, advertisements that leave nothing to the imagination. I won't describe one here out of respect for the gathering, but there used to be one by the underground where I lived. It's always very shocking to me. And I finally realized that what was shocking to me is not just that there's something explicit, because you go to some places, like look at the medieval art, and frankly, it's revealing. The medieval European art, I mean. Or I'm from California, not exactly the most covered place in the world, but I don't feel the same sort of a shock if I go to the beach. And I finally realized that what bothers me, and this is just me, it might be a cultural thing, is I feel like the culture of objectification, which has developed through, one can say, the materialistic culture of modernity, in the sense that things are oftentimes in the public sphere valued on the material level and not as part of a broader spiritual cosmology, has led to, I think, a very material and dehumanized approach to the lawful relationship between man and woman. So when I'm looking at a certain advertisement, for example, with a certain explicit picture, it's not just that it's showing some things, but it's very cut off from the spirituality of the lawful act, which can result, for example, in the miracle of creation, which in essence is part of the divine act. The divine act is to create, and the parents create, or divorced from other sorts of values which one can consider very spiritual and which are in harmony with Islamic teachings about spousal relations, such as love. Allah is loving. Love is a primary characteristic of the divine in Islamic mystical traditions, especially, but especially in general. And this is, ideally part of the lawful relation. But when you just see someone who's cut off from that and being used to make money and, maybe sell SIM cards or something, it is, a banalization of something that should be essentially spiritual. And I think when I compare that to things in the past, or even in cultures where maybe there aren't so many sensitivities to explicitness, but there is more of a human context still involved, it doesn't bother me as much. And I think that is, something that is very much lacking, this, first of all, the sense of the spiritual in that way, but also, of course, transmitting the spiritual through both the feminine and the masculine. However, I'm going to now make a critical comment, because I was told I'm allowed to be mildly critical here. And I do feel like sometimes as Muslims, some of us, like not all of us, but some of us engage in a bit of banalization when looking at the absence of Hazrat Fatima from these portrayals, in the sense that we don't see her, like not that she's not there, but you see a silhouette or a shadow. I gave one argument that this is veiling spirituality, but sometimes there is, and again, to be blunt, a very sexualized approach that, sister, astaghfirullah, be like Hazrat Fatima. Why did you walk by the men's section of the mosque? And, I remember once, did not put this photo in here because it would be impolite. I had a photo that someone took of me once with a little bit of wrist that had slipped. Someone actually took the trouble to write me a long letter about the importance of wrist covers, and they sent me diagrams to explain the matter and circles and everything. And it was very disturbing to them. And, I appreciate the effort and the sentiment, but the point being that sometimes there is this over-focus on women's, covering and so forth, that instead of perhaps being something which contributes to the development of society and healthy relationships, becomes a bit objectifying, that you're focusing on the clothes instead of the person, which is also not healthy. If you think about Hazrat Fatima, and the other thing that's not necessarily healthy is sometimes people will use her as an example of why women should not be involved in society, because the best thing for a woman is not to be seen by a man, etc. Most places aren't like this, but in some places they do. For example, say women shouldn't go to a mosque. The woman's mosque is her home, for example, because the woman's sphere is the private sphere, and this is the portrayal of Hazrat Fatima. And yet, when you look at her life, we do know that she was very actively involved in the Islamic movement, if you will, both the spreading the religion and the social justice aspects, the teaching aspects. We do know that from very young, she went out to look after her father's wounds. She would defend him, as to her ability from the enemies. Obviously, young people can't do that. She didn't hide her stances on public matters. She gave the khutbah of the speech of Fadak. So she's not an invisible figure in the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I really should qualify that statement. I didn't, before coming here, look exactly where she is in the seerah literature. But the point is, she's not invisible as an active member of the community or someone who was genuinely hidden from the rest of society, even though, this sort of archetype of hidden spirituality can be associated with her. And yet sometimes we, or some people at least, maybe interchange these things with each other without necessarily thinking it through. So I'm putting that out there to ponder. Let's look at a couple more, briefly. Yes, so this is Hazrat Zaynab, or Zaynab bint Ali ibn Abi Talib, so the daughter of Fatima Zahra, who is best remembered in history for her speeches after the martyrdom of Al-Hussein ibn Ali, as many of us know. And in particular, speeches that were very moving and did change public interest. And yet there are a couple ways that she is oftentimes understood. And this is going to start to sound a little bit repetitive here. There's a book there which I suspect really has nothing to do with what I'm saying, but it's called Zaynab, Victor or Victim. I think it's a new book, I don't remember, but it's something along those lines. But basically, these are the two ways we tend to present her, as a victor or as a victim, as someone who presents women as strong and powerful and equally involved, both in the public and private movement, if you will, of Islam and standing up for what is right, and also spirituality. The prayer is kind of cut off the screen there, but that's her in prayer, presumably in Karbala. But on the other hand, some people will also push the other portrayal, that no one ever saw her shadow. Doesn't happen here, but in some places they will say that, don't go out of the house because no one ever saw Zaynab's shadow. That is not at all in our hadith books. Is this being broadcast anywhere? Yeah, I was actually censored on one of our Islamic television channels for saying that's not in our hadith books. Censored and censured, which I pointed out it isn't. Please give me a reference. You will not find a single reference to it in any of our hadith books. But the idea is very prevalent in some cultures. And, these are examples of how people frame sacred figures in the ideals of their own cultures. If a culture is very restrictive towards women, there's likely going to be a tendency to put that in or to present her, as being unable to care for herself. That sometimes, comes up a lot as part of the pathos of the Karbala narrative. Zaynab has no men to look after her. Zaynab is an orphan, etc., which, it's sad. But when we are doing that, it's also taking away from the portrayal of strength. And most of the time we have both of them. But we don't usually stop and think about these things, the messages we are receiving or hearing. Very brief examples. Actually, let's just skip to the end, because this is family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, very briefly. Actually, can you go back? Yeah, a couple very brief ones, like 1 minute or so. Back one more. This is also cut off. These beautiful manuscripts get cut off. And any thoughts on who this might be?
Sorry, what I'll do.
No, that's nice.
If I
Yeah.
transfer it to there,
Ooh, cool.
you can all see it much better. I was trying to message it now. One second. Oh, sorry.
I actually, yeah. Well, anyway, any quick guesses who this might be? I know it's not overly clear, but that is a lady in the middle. Sometimes it's hard to tell in the manuscripts. Who? Okay, looking a bit royal, maybe, being attended upon. Hint, royal. I'll give you some. There's only so many people we have. It's a Quranic person. Close, but not quite there. But that's yes, Queen of Sheba, Bilqis. Okay, Bilqis is the Quranic answer to the question of can women hold political power? Because the Quran very clearly presents her as a capable leader, and definitely there are capable female women who hold political power in the Muslim majority world. It's not like it doesn't happen. However, despite that very clear portrayal of her as a good, wise, and intelligent and capable ruler, we do know that in the classical tradition, there was an attempt to sideline her a bit by claiming that if she's such a good ruler, she can't be a normal human, so she must be half jinn. She's female. What's a female going to be doing like this? Now, I don't understand it in some of the Qasas al-Anbiya literature, but the narrations are a bit more than a bit questionable. I mean, sometimes they say like she had hooves, like when she lifted her dress, and she's like, the hair is like the jinn fur or whatever. Alam al-Majlisi, for example, rejects that as ridiculous because there's no evidence in the text that Bilqis was half of a jinn. But I just wanted to point that out as an example of how sometimes, some stories which do enter lore, for lack of a better word, to some degree, end up sidelining people because of these sorts of preconceptions or ideas, and it is very subtle. Most people who tell these stories are not necessarily thinking of the ramifications of it. But, if you want to argue for it on a religious basis, because you genuinely believe it, I'm not going to argue with you. But I'm pointing out sometimes there is apparently some other issue. Last one, the Virgin Mary, peace be upon her. There are many ways to see her, but one thing I have had in mind is whether in the Quranic portrayal she is seen as iconoclastic or fitting into stereotypical roles. I'm saying that because as a female, I oftentimes get asked at Islamic gatherings to give the lecture on the role of women in Islam as wives, daughters, and mothers. And can you please explain, I was asked to do this actually this year. Can you explain how Hazrat Fatima and Bibi Maryam, the Virgin Mary, teach us how to be, to fulfill the role of women as wives, mothers, and daughters? It's like, okay, first of all, in the Islamic tradition, she's not married. And second of all, with all respect, and I'm not casting any aspersions, but no Muslim is actually going to tell you that the children of Imam Ali and Hazrat Fatima, so Hassan and Hussein, or Jesus, peace be upon them, were great solely because of their upbringing. I read in the Quran, Jesus speaks from the cradle. He's already got it as a child, so to speak. I'm sure the upbringing was good. But my point is that's not at all the same thing that we're dealing with today when you've got a 15-year-old who's on drugs and another one who's doing something else. And, you've got the life challenges that aren't necessarily there. And yet there is an attempt sometimes to push sort of expected and stereotypical discussions. Whereas if you look at the Quranic story, her entire life is very iconoclastic. She goes to worship in the temple, which is unheard of as a woman. She comes back to her people as a child, according to the Quranic story, which is unheard of as a woman. And Allah asks her not to say anything, to let the child speak, so not even to defend herself. So there's definitely a very, in the Quranic portrayal, a very revolutionary thread, and yet sometimes that's not comfortable for people and it gets tamed. Okay, final one. I'm not going to tell you which portrayals to use. However, I'm just pointing out that they're there and you should think about them. Especially, and I really had online here in mind, when we're reading and listening to and hearing things, and especially when passing them on, it's good to think about what is going on, and is this the only way to be seeing things? Is it the best way? Is it true? Is it helpful, etc.? I have those icons on the bottom because I think this especially comes up on platforms like Twitter, where it's just so easy to click retweet or to click the heart or whatever. But sometimes people do that because something triggers a memory in them, if you will. It's something we've heard, so we like it or share it. But we're not actually stopping to think, is this actually something that is beneficial to society that we should be supporting? Is it something that actually matches the prophetic ethos, even if it's being shared kind of in an Islamic sort of wording? After all, Allah teaches in the Holy Quran to seek the truth, and that's one of our primary responsibilities. So, and Allah tells us to think. So that is my my summary. That it's good for us to think about these things, and this is an overview of how we can think about these things. And inshallah, if we do that, there will be more relevancy, and we won't have to hold conferences like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Amina, for that, for your presentation. While you were talking, something that just came to my mind was that we tend to, when we look at some of these ladies, of sacred ladies, we put our own cultural lens on. Because when you look at some of the incidents, for example, you mentioned Lady Zaynab. She went through a traumatic experience in Karbala, but yet she had the ability, the courage to stand up against Yazid in his courtyard. Now that talks a lot about that particular person. She wasn't some sort of a scared someone who didn't have the authority. She had that within her to go and defend herself. And again, when you talked about Lady Fatima, again, during the time when the Prophet passed away, it was a very difficult time for Islam, but yet she came out and she spoke her mind. So when we sort of look at some of these figures, we sort of put our cultural lens and we sort of package them again in what we feel that they were. So thank you for that. I'd now like to welcome Sheikh Umar ibn Ramadan, and he'll talk about the women of the Ahlulbayt, a reply to feminism. That should be very interesting. Please welcome him with an Nari Salat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين والطاهرين وصحابته رضوان الله عليهم أجمعين. قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد بعده أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. الصلاة والسلام عليك وعلى آلك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. الصلاة والسلام عليك وعلى آلك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله رحمة للعالمين. First of all, I would like to thank Baab-Ul-Ilm for organizing this conference, and I pray that this is the beginning of an engagement that we can discuss a number of issues that are pertinent to our existence. I recited a verse from the Quran in which is from Surah Al-Hujurat 49 verse number 13, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses humanity as a whole, Ya ayyuhan nas, that all mankind, or has some translated as mankind, or some may say all human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we created you from a single male and female. And the verse continues on about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about this notion about creating tribes and people for a certain purpose. The purpose was li ta'arafuhu. And we don't have time to go through what the Mufassirin have written, but generally they said that the meaning of this is to mutually benefit from each other. The objective of Allah creating humanity in such diversity was so that people may benefit from each other. Now we have an assumption, unfortunately, and that's based upon how people view Islam in the 21st century. That feminists and certain human rights activists, they have criticized the treatment of women or women's right in many patriarchal countries, or countries that are dominated by Muslims, or countries that have this logo or this idea that we are implementing Sharia. This is a Sharia-friendly country. And according to Aziz al-Hibri, a very famous academic, she said that this criticism stems from their contentment with the patriarchal, religiously orientated Sharia countries that Muslims mainly dominate. Now, secular feminists, in the opinion of al-Hibri, have strived to great lengths in attempting to make a direct linkage between Islam and what happens in these countries. The Quran and the violation of women's rights and so forth. And it's vital to understand that, and this is something she said it's extremely vital to understand that the vast majority of women, when you interview them, Muslim women, they have this sense of loyalty more to religion than to custom and to gender issues, or in regards to Quranic interpretation. Now, one thing we cannot do is we cannot deny that Muslims, let me repeat that again, we cannot deny that Muslims and not Islam has problems with gender. And again, I'm not making a generical comment, I'm referring to specific Muslims and specific people of culture. Again, I'm not just referring to the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, India or Bangladesh. Culture around the world, wherever we may be, it stems from that idea that people, when we say judge Islam, don't judge it according to Muslims. Judge it according to what the Quran and what the prophetic way was. Looking at his sunnah, how he implemented his life, how he replied to these problems that were occurring in society. But no one can deny this, and I think you have to be quite ignorant to do this, that if you have this issue that Muslims don't have an issue with gender, we do have an issue with gender, and we don't address it. That's the problem. We don't address it in a mature manner. One perspective is that we have those who feel insecure, and that's because of a sense of injustice that stems from their treatment in society. Women, how they've been treated in society. Sexualization of women. Okay, sisters sit at the back of the masjid. I mean, some are even privileged to sit in the masjid, let alone get in the masjid for some places. You know, certain masajids have absolutely no facilities to cater for women. Or go to the cellar and we'll put a TV there. TV is a modern phenomenon. We'll put a speaker there. I remember in 2000, I did a conference in Manchester. We had 2,000 Muslims. And Imam Siraj, one of my friends from New York, was there, and different people. And we made a very big mistake. And, you know, that was the early days. We were young people, and we put the sisters in a room with a small TV. You know them really, big TVs, yeah? You kids won't know what they are. You got the smart TVs now. And let's just say the women didn't reply. And we had to make some adjustments. Alhamdulillah. And equally, we have a group of males who feel really fed up by the growing influence of certain Muslim feminist movements who often condemn all men as sexist and inherently people who hate and have this hatred towards women. Now, maybe the title of my lecture should have been more about engaging rather than a solution or an answer to feminism. The problem that I find is that it's impossible to address all issues tonight or today. It's impossible. However, what it requires is firstly for both groups, from both angles, from both perspectives, to be able to engage with each other holistically. We need to come together, both people, irrespective of the views that we have, to deal with a common problem. Gender issue isn't a male issue. It's a common issue between male and female. It's an issue that we should sit down and have a dialogue about it. You have people who challenge Islam and say, Islam is this, Islam is that, and what do? We reply with it in a negative manner. Oh, this is an agenda by the West, this is a secularist idea. We don't engage with them, we don't sit with them, and we don't have dialogue with them. And what happens is we become confrontational in one sense. They become confrontational, we move away, and we don't really achieve anything. But if we sit with each other and debate about the roles and what's happened and the historical perspectives, and listen to views which may be controversial. I don't really think what the sister said was controversial, but we should be able to give her that platform to express her views. Now, 1,975 masajids are in the UK, approximately. 28% of those masajids don't provide facilities for women. That's a statistic which even I disagree with, really. I think that was really manufactured to give a certain image that Muslims are engaging and whatever. I think that the percentage is much more higher than that. In my experience of visiting Sunni masajids up and down the country, 28%. 50% of Southeast Asian masajids, mosques, that are run by South Asian people from Pakistan, India, so forth, have no accommodation for women in their masjid. None. Absolutely nothing at all. Men outnumber women in charity trust, has charity trustees in management or whatever, 2-1. Shocking figures these are about women and what's happening in the Muslim communities specifically. Now, one of the reasons behind why we have this discrepancy is because the lack of being able to interpret sacred text and looking at controversial or interpretation which people gave in the past and then contextualizing it in a modern society. So what we did was, we looked at what scholars had said previously about what the role of a woman was and what a woman was. And we used that as a premises that these are your duties and these are your roles and this is what you need to do. And what we never did was engage with the Quran and the Sunnah. It was just following what the opinion was. It's what we call taking the literal meaning of it. It's a modern problem. In Islam, we have this ideal of naql wal aql, which is a scholars' debate. Using rationality when you approach the religious text. When you look at revelation, this is, for example, a problem which the Salafi, the Wahhabi, our brothers, they have this issue amongst their theology, which is they only go for the naql. They only apply the textual evidences of the literal meaning of what it says in the Quranic verse. What does the hadith say? Whereas the predominant view amongst the Muslims, Sunni and even other schools like the Mu'tazilites and other Muslims, was no, you have to apply aql. In fact, the Mu'tazilites, one of the early sects in Islam, had this idea that religious revelation cannot be understood without rationality. And if religious revelation went against rationality, rationality takes precedence. So you can understand how well developed the Muslims were. So these people interpreted verses in the Quran, certain prophetic hadith, in a negative, in a narrow-minded manner. We need to apply a new concept of the maqasid al-sharia, I think. I'm a very strong proponent of maqasid. From the Muslim countries, maqasid means the higher objectives of the sharia. I'm not going to bore you through that. You can go do your own research, you can do YouTube, you can do search on Google. But the maqasid is something, let me give you, to put it in simple terms, the only country that really implemented it to an extent is Malaysia. Malaysia, during the time of Mahathir Mohamad, implemented this concept. To an extent, it's debatable whether it was successful or not. They're looking at it again, about using the maqasid to deal with modern issues that are facing Muslims in Muslim countries. So how do you use the higher objectives of the Sharia to deal with feminism? How do you use these examples to deal with the problems that we have? So this, where does this all stem from? It stems from a legal maxim from the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Messenger of Allah said, which means women are your equal partners, or women are equal partners to men. That is the hadith, that is the prophetic way. Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi, one of the great Sunni scholars of hadith, 310, he was born and he died in 388, a dispute. He came 54 years after Imam al-Bukhari. This hadith I mentioned to you is from Bukhari itself, one of the foremost authoritative books for Sunni Islam. He's one of the, and not just a senior scholar, he's actually the first person to ever write a commentary on Bukhari in the history. Abu Sulaiman, he's very famous. He says the following. He says, his sayings regarding the women are equal partners of men. He says that women are counterparts of men, means they're equal and their likeness in creation and nature is equality. As if they're split off from men. He says in jurisprudence, al-fiqh, it is affirmation of the analogy and equivalence in its ruling. Equal by equal, such that if the speech is conveyed in a male grammatical form, it is also addressed to women in the same manner. So this is a scholar from early Islam, fundamentally saying to people, this is the way you should approach religious sacred knowledge. Then we have another point which I've mentioned earlier on about people just taking literal meaning. And you see this from the pulpits, unfortunately. You see this from people who have the loudest mouth, unfortunately. People, who, have the biggest following on social media. And some of them have these ideas that they say, deficiency of women. And they use a hadith in Bukhari, misinterpreting the hadith. Hadith means a prophetic saying, in which the messenger apparently said that women are deficient in intellect and religion. And they use this as the premises, and you hear this up and down in the masajids. And I've actually heard certain imams that actually on the minbar say, oh, women are like this, and majority of the women in the majority of the inhabitants of hellfire will be women. Sisters, you should lower your voices. a man shouldn't hear your voice because your voice is the aura. It's part of that area or part of that aspect of a body of a woman that should not be exposed to a male. In other words, satisfying the male and the male being given that advantageness. So the people approach this hadith and misinterpreted it. The people who interpreted this hadith and take it out of context. The hadith has no connotation to ontological statement or cosmological statement. The Prophet isn't referring to gender here. Has nothing to do with gender at all. And you will see what I'm referring to. When the Prophet said this hadith to his companions, it was on the Eid prayer. It was a prayer after the Eid that the Prophet looked at the males and said to the males that you should give some donation, you should donate, you should give in the way of Allah, charity. And then he turned to the females and he said that you should also give in the way to charity. You should also give this donation. And then the Prophet turned to them and he used this word, naqisatun, which some people have interpreted or translated. I call it mistranslation as deficiency. I prefer using the word reducing is a better translation of the word in context. And the Prophet said, he refers to them and he says to them that the reduction of your religion is that women, when you are through your menstruation period, then Allah gives you the leniency that you do not pray and you do not observe the fast. And then when the women turn around and said, "O Messenger of Allah, that is in religion. That is in regards to our religion. What is it in regards to the reduction or the deficiencies people say in mind?" And that is when the Messenger of Allah said, "Is it not the testimony of a woman like half of a man?" And that is when the women turn around and said, "Yes, O Messenger of Allah." Now, people have used this hadith as a premises for two things. Number one, to show that women are deficient. And then number two, women are not equal to men in their testimony. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, a very interesting individual who is a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, and I quote him for a certain reason, because the proponents of this notion that women are less than men are promoted by a certain aspect from the Muslim Ummah that predominantly follow Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah's understanding of religion. Ibn al-Qayyim says the following, and this is quite interesting in how he addresses this issue, looking at this specific hadith, specifically looking at men and women. Is a woman deficient or not? He says the woman is equal to the man in truthfulness, in honesty, in piety and otherwise. If it is fear that she will forget or misremember, she is strengthened with another like herself. This is referring to the Quranic verse about a business transaction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that if males are not there, two females' testimony is equal to one male testimony. Two females may give a shahadat, and that will be equivalent to one male. This is used as premises to say, where is the equality of this? But the problem is we don't look at the contextual understanding of how the hadith was mentioned or how the Quranic verse was mentioned. The Quran was revealed 1400 years ago, but it has to be taken into context. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveal this verse and say to women that two of you, your testimonies, two of them is equal to one man? Was it to show some deficiency in woman? No. Was it to show that a woman was not truthfulness? No. Was it to show, and we know through modern science and psychology, that a woman is as bright as a male? In fact, they are more brighter, mashallah. In my house, women are far more better achievers than as males. So it doesn't make sense. On one sense, you have the Quran saying to us that a testimony of two women is this is an equality. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the hadith said that Allah said, the Prophet said that man and woman are equal. However, what's not taken into consideration is what does God really mean in this verse. This is when you take the literal meaning of a verse or the hadith. It means that in Mecca at that time, women were treated with no respect, as the Shaykh has mentioned. Women had no role in business transactions. The job of a woman was predominantly to look after the house. She had a major burden on her. Islam came to gradually change this oppressive behavior. there was no stagnation of changing realities of what happened in Arabia. So when women were persecuted, Islam never came and said, it's ended now. Yes, the Quran revealed the verse and said, this is wrong. But there's a process of change, an evolvement. It takes time. In the sense that women at that time were not used to transactions. So what Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah then says afterwards, in which he then quotes Ibn Taymiyyah, he's quoting Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretation of this. He says, what does it mean? It means that whatever there is amongst the testimony of women in which there is no fear of habitual error, they are considered the half of Iman. It means what? It means that if the woman, for example, is not used to transactions, business, interactions with her counterparts, because why did the Quran want to do this? The Quran wanted to give leniency to the woman. Allah wanted to reduce the burden upon a woman at that time. That is why the Quran said that the testimony of two is equivalent to one. But that was in the context of a transaction. There's another incident of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal mentions, one of the great Sunni Imams. He says that if a male was to make a will, and there was no males to be witness to that will, he says, would I accept the testimony of a woman? Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal said he would accept the testimony, and not only would he accept it, he said the female's testimony is equivalent to the male's. There's no deficiency in it. Another unique point is Al-Dhahabi, one of the greatest scholars in Sunni Islam in regards to prophetic hadith, which we call Ilm al-Rijal. He said the following, which is really interesting. He says, I do not know amongst the women narrators anyone, listen to this point. He says, I do not know amongst the women narrators anyone accused of lying, nor anyone that abandoned the hadith. Then he listed a list of over 120 female leading scholars. In other words, Al-Dhahabi could not find a single hadith, because we know males, generally in hadith literature, you have a weak and you have a fabricated narration. Al-Dhahabi said that from all the fabricated narrations, there is not a single narration from a female in Sunni hadith literature. Look how far Al-Dhahabi goes. And then you have, why do you have these, the topic is very long, but you have this ideal or this idea in our communities, or the woman should lower her voice, her voice should not be heard. It is, again, contradiction to, we have the incident in Bukhari of Sayyida Aisha, that when she used to teach hadith, she would teach hadith and she used to teach it by speaking to her male counterparts. In fact, Sayyida Fatima, we have the narration in which she came to Abu Bakr and asked for fadak, her inheritance. And she gave a very lengthy khutbah, which the historians have mentioned, meaning she signified how you should be able to speak in front of a person. Sayyida Zaynab was another example which people have mentioned, how she stood in front of Yazid and spoke. What does that show? That demonstrates to us, what is that incident of when Sayyida Zaynab spoke in front of Yazid? Not only did she save Islam, not only did she save the entire family from being further persecuted and humiliated, but she demonstrated how to speak in front of a tyrant, a female who man looks at as weak and vulnerable. Hence the reason why, if you look at these, in fact, if you look, and I finish off with these 2-3 points, even if you look at Sayyidah Fatima salam alayha, in her entire life, when her father was persecuted, it was her that came to the defense of her father. And what does that show? It's not only showing us that she loved her father, but it demonstrates the role of women or female activism in society, in holding leaders to accountability. So the reason we have this negativity, the reason why we have these misinterpretations, the reason why we have is because we tend to look at a certain hadith and we take the literal meaning without looking at the context of what it means. So that is why scholars in the modern sense have said we have to re-evaluate these verses. We have to look at these verses in a new sense, That is why in Sunni Islam there is an attempt to look at these verses of, is the testimony of a single female acceptable against a single male? The scholars have now said in Al-Azhar that this is acceptable. Why? Human beings evolve, and we have to evolve with the Quranic context in a modern time. The problem we have, and I conclude with this, is when we don't engage with each other, when we don't sit with each other. There is a certain attempt by certain people to malign Islam and show Islam as a backward, whatever type of understanding they have. But they are equally responsible, just like Muslims who call for violence. They're equally responsible for giving us this narrow mind, this view of Islam, which is not really Islam. Islam is a very broad, beautiful deen. It's a religion of hikmah. It develops, and it will develop. It will continue to develop. However, we have to have a certain framework, and we have to look at these verses in a holistical manner rather than taking the literal meaning. And inshallah, I pray that we can, inshallah, look at this. There's many issues I want to talk about, but these are just a few points I wanted to address. Thank you very much for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Sheikh, for that presentation and clarifying that when we look at our hadiths and our Quranic text, there needs to be a context to it. And I think the problem that we have or we're facing is that some of these judgments or analysis are being done out of context. And that's why we're in the problem that we are as far as the Muslims are concerned. But Sheikh, I would also go far. It's not a Muslim problem. It's a problem. It's a worldwide problem. You know, you're seeing that in today's Me Too movement. You know, you look at Hollywood, how the women of Hollywood were exploited in politics. Everywhere we have the same problem. It's not just isolated to Muslims, but there is a sort of the Quran makes reference to this, and perhaps gives us a way to navigate through some of these issues. Before I introduce our last speaker or welcome our last speaker, today's program has been sponsored, or today's refreshments have been sponsored by our friend Wakar Hussain. So can I please ask you to recite Surah Fatiha once and Surah Ikhlas 3 times, and gift it to his late father, Maroom Sayyid Mazhar Ali Shah, or the sawab of this recitation to his father. Thank you, Wakar, for that. And just as a side note, Wakar is a proud owner of Cha-Cha-Cha in Halifax. So if anyone's visiting Halifax, please pop in. They'll serve some wonderful chai. By the way, your competitor from Chaiwala is just sitting next to you as well. So perhaps you two can, you can take him out and probably have a conversation there. Our next speaker and our final speaker, before we move on to the Q&A session, is Sister Daisy Khan. Sister, can you bring her on Zoom, Adnan? Yeah. Sister, if you want to, you're there, we can see you. I'm not sure if you can see us, but we can see. Okay, thank you. I did give her an introduction before you joined in. So Sister Daisy Khan is joining us from States, and she will talk about the divinity's role for women. So over to you, Sister Daisy Khan.
Assalamu alaikum, and I should say good afternoon. For me, it's morning, and I begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Of course, as a last speaker, I have the difficult task of being somewhat repetitive, but I will try my best. Although I will be repetitive, I'll try my best to provide a slightly different perspective of what has already been said. Many questions we ask today are actually not new. For example, some conservative Muslims believe that a voice of a woman is haram, aura, or taboo, which one of our sheikhs just mentioned. But what is interesting is that women contesting, arguing, questioning injustice or male authority for centuries yet have been doing this. And the Quran celebrates the feminine voice and gives it power to argue, discuss, and contest in Surah Mujadala, which has already been mentioned. What is important is that it invites the female voice back to the conversation. In this particular verse, the Quran takes us on this trip to a moment when this happens during the life of the Prophet, when Khawla came to him and complained about her husband who wanted to, terminate his relationship by declaring her as a mother to him. And the Quranic narrative unfolds in a manner that really requires reflection. I mean, it says, God has heard the word of that who is arguing with you concerning her husband, raising her complaint to God, and God hears your dialogue, for God is ever listening and constantly the seer. The passage deals with word, argument, and complaint, but from the divine perspective, Allah's perspective, the conversation is heard as dialogue, elevating this Arabian woman's argument, the problem she raises, and the whole dynamic into a form in which justice is being sought, and hence the Quran recasts it as a vehicle that reaches the divine. And of course, this is not the only verse where this has happened. This has happened in other instances where a woman has complained to the Prophet and a verse has come down. So many aspects of our religious tradition the world over are reflective of patriarchal tendencies, which has been spoken about today, which, like any other religious tradition, was canonized in an age of empires, wealth, and power. And those of us who are interested in the hermeneutics, I've been doing a lot of deep study about this issue. And a lot of it has to do with who was in power, what was the prevailing custom, and how did the jurists feel compelled to ignore the Quran and to create rulings that were not really based in the Quran. So if you look at Mujadala, I, as a Muslim woman today, know that it is not only a right to think, reflect, contest, and contribute, but it's a duty before God, because only with effort and ijtihad, legal thinking, as our Sheikh just mentioned, we can create and serve justice. So accepting the invitation to connect to the divine, to reach out, to ask, and to question is a serious matter. And even before the event of Khawla, the wife of Prophet Muhammad, Salama, also asked that very daring question: why is the Quran addressing only men and not mentioning women? Because as you know, the early women were by the Prophet's side. They went to Medina, they were with him. The very first martyr was a woman. I mean, these are women that were literally as much of his followers as men were. So her question marks a significant moment in the orientation of the Quranic revelation and in the history of Islam, when one of the most beautiful verses came down, 33-35, and was revealed to the Prophet as a response to her question. And by the way, this is something that every Muslim should be speaking about and repeating for the Western audiences, introducing for the first time, perhaps in all of human history, a gender-inclusive verse or gender-inclusive language, and which, gives women absolute equality. When I mention this, many Americans, my colleagues here, especially people of faith, are stunned by this verse. And I think that we really need to harp on this as much as we can. Of course, we need our brothers to do that more than women. So I will not mention this verse because we all know what 33-35 is: the believing women, the true men and women, the patient men and women, the humble men and women. And for them, God has prepared forgiveness and great reward. So this divine dialogue is a gift to humanity. It happens again when Aisha is slandered after being separated from the Prophet. Once again, Allah intervenes and sent forth a revelation proclaiming her innocence, but also setting a very high bar for accusing women of wrongdoing. So this divine dialogue is a true gift. So today we continue to revive the path of Khawla and Salama, which began in the founding years of Islam. If we truly understand the jihad and ijtihad that we are undertaking, we won't have enough words to thank these women. The Quran's vision refutes the traditional Muslim view, which is the challenge we're all facing today. The Quran recognizes and praises women in a definitive role, yes, as mothers, but from the very beginning of Islam, women filled diverse and crucial roles in their societies, families, and faith. These women were intermediaries of the sacred, divinely charged sometimes with preeminent roles as women, as wives, as mothers, who protected, sheltered, influenced, taught, and disseminated the prophetic message. Throughout their lives, they endured hardship, resisted the powerful and the mighty, and exemplified the ideals of courage and faith in the face of adversity. Their stories particularly show that they are autonomous agents capable of receiving God's guidance, and that in the eyes of God, they are absolute moral and spiritual equals to men. Let us begin with the earliest of the women, the matriarch of Abrahamic religions, Hagar, whose story has deep relevance. She's mentioned in the Bible and is a key figure in Islam as an archetype of courage, conviction, and bravery. As she chose to stay behind and look for sustenance for her child, God sent forth Zamzam water, which became the bloodline of this new town called Mecca. This woman wound up shaping the destiny of billions of Muslims today, and her sacrifice is a reminder to us of our own personal struggle. Do we ever wonder why God chose a woman for this role? After all, Abraham was enough. Abraham had a very important message. But what was the reason for Hagar? What if she had not submitted to the will of God, as conveyed by Abraham? Would the town of Mecca have flourished? Would Prophet Muhammad have been born there and received his revelation? Would Khadija, a tradeswoman, offer marriage to a young Muhammad? Would Bilal, an enslaved African, be freed by the Prophet to exemplify human equality? Would Fatima exhibit beautiful patience to endure deep hardships? Would Aisha have spent years spreading the message of the Prophet? It was Hagar, her trust in God, her determination, bravery, and self-sacrifice that founded Mecca, home to today's, the two holiest sites of Islam. And then there's Asiya, Pharaoh's wife, called the first adopter. She is a risk taker who adopts a child with the knowledge that he does not share the Pharaoh's religion. And she is charged by Allah to protect infant Moses from her tyrannical husband. She remains steadfast against her own husband, who tortured her for believing in Moses. And the Quran praises her by name for the great courage and faith she displayed by fulfilling her God-given mandate to raise Moses. She exhibits strength of woman and their innate connection with God, while exemplifying the ideal of bravery. Then Bilqis has already been mentioned, Queen of Sheba, who's hailed as an archetype of good political leader for her transparency, reliance in public consultation, and the priority she placed on the welfare of her people over all else. She, as a woman, is contrasted against the Pharaoh, the archetype of tyranny, showing that powerful women can be righteous and true. And when she receives a letter from King Solomon requesting the submission of her and her people, she seeks consensus amongst her advisors and chooses not to go to war. She chose the path of non-confrontation to protect the well-being of her people, a decision hailed in the Quran as a wise leader. Maryam, the virgin and the sacrificer. She is held so highly, in such high esteem, that a chapter in the Quran is named after her. And an honor granted to only 8 people. Her righteousness, steadfastness, and chastity made her fit to receive the breath of the divine in her womb. And she gives birth to Jesus. Embodying the ideal of faith in God like no other, Maryam persisted through the hardship of carrying a child without a father and out of wedlock, thus fulfilling her covenant with God. Without her, Jesus would not have come into this world. And she is referred to as the mother of Jesus, as opposed to, Jesus's mother. And then only to see her only child, a word from God, raised and nailed to a cross. Khadija, the Prophet's wife, was the first to acknowledge his prophethood and the first Muslim. She is confident. She's a confident woman and a philanthropist. And we know her story, so I won't repeat her story. But the important thing is her spiritual support of the Prophet and her financial support allowed the Prophet to spread the word of God while continuing her own journey towards union with God. And the Prophet's profound love, loyalty, and trust and respect towards her provides the primary model for how a Muslim man should treat his wife. We frown upon love marriages, we frown upon, a younger man. I mean, how many of us, if you have a 25-year-old son comes to you and says, Dad, Mom, I want to marry a 40-year-old woman. By the way, she has 4 children already. I mean, how many of you would say, okay, that's fine? He wasn't even a prophet at that time. So this is once again an example that we have to, set for our future generations. Fatima, as has already been mentioned, resembled her father the most. And it's through her that the entire progeny of the family of the Prophet is traced through her. And if it wasn't for Fatima, I don't know if we would have the house of the Prophet, or her entire lineage is the Prophet's lineage is basically carried through her. And she supported the Prophet and defended him from persecution. She was so devoted to her father's work that she is named as one of the holiest women. And in fact, she passed away shortly after the Prophet, as you know, after he told her she would be the first to join in heaven. So the connection that she had with the Prophet was much deeper. And she is remembered for her piety, her compassion, and her lifelong dedication to Islam. Then there's Hafsa, another of the Prophet's wife, who was known for being strong, opinionated, but she was also educated. And she memorized and protected the divine message and was valued for her ability to read. And then she was responsible for preserving and protecting the folios of the Quran from manipulation by political figures. Once again, when Marwan, the governor of Medina, requested the folios, she resolutely denied his request, showing her trustworthiness, loyalty, and commitment to the integrity of the Quran for future generations. I mean, this is another thing that we need to stress. Our Shaykh should be stressing this point, that it was a woman who was keeping the Quran and safeguarding against corruption. What if it had been corrupted? Would we have this message? Then, of course, there's Aisha, the last wife of the Prophet, an important scholar. We know that she narrated close to 2,200 hadith. And she eventually dedicated 45 years of her life after the Prophet's death to spread the message of Islam, because she was young and she, lived on for many years. Then there are the women of the Prophet's household, the wives that are not necessarily either mentioned directly in the Quran, but we know about their lives, who played a vital role to advance the prophetic mission. And it's important for us to let our younger generations understand what these marriages were about, because many people in the West do not know how to address this issue of the Prophet's marriages. They hear that he married 11 women and everybody goes into a brief shell shock. And many of our younger generations, younger people, do not know the details of who these wives were and why he married them. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to explain that. These marriages exemplified the need, first and foremost, for the care of orphans and widows, and also for the need to establish peace and friendly relations with formerly antagonistic groups. All these marriages were not necessarily initiated by the Prophet himself or his whims and his desires. Some of them were sanctioned by God. For example, after his last marriage, Maimuna, the Prophet was instructed not to marry anymore. because by that time the objective of his marriages was achieved, as the Prophet's mission was near complete. So the first person he married was a war widow who was 65 years old, who was one of the earliest converts. And when she married the Prophet, she freed him, who had also been recently widowed himself, from the child care and the household duties that he was carrying after Khadija passed away. Then there was Salama, and she came from a tribe which was his arch enemy. She was amongst the first to migrate to Medina. She had a fifth child when she became widowed. She was pregnant with a fifth child. And after she delivers the child, she's married to the Prophet, and she forges an alliance with her tribe. Besides tending to his children and his household, she became his trusted political advisor. Then there was Zaynab. She was 36 years old, divorcee, who was the daughter of his paternal uncle and his ex-wife and the ex-wife of his adopted son, Zayd. This marriage was divinely sanctioned by the Quran. And this marriage was emphasized the invalidity of the age-old Arab practice of taking adopted sons as real sons. Then there was Habiba, who was 36 years old, who migrated to Abyssinia, and her ex-husband deserted Islam. He actually became a Christian. And her father was Abu Sufyan, and you know who Abu Sufyan was. He was the Prophet's bitter enemy. But through her marriage, her tribe came towards Islam. Another widow was Zuwaira, whose father and husband were also the Prophet's arch enemies. When they were defeated in battle, they became prisoners, and her father offered a ransom for her freedom. But she, married the Prophet, and at her request, she married the Prophet, and all the prisoners of war of her tribe were freed as a result of that. Then came Safiya. She was a Jewish war widow whose father was the chief of a Jewish tribe. When her husband was killed, she became a prisoner. When she was freed, the Prophet proposed marriage to her, and when she accepted, his other wives would mock her because they were worried that her loyalty was the Jewish tribe. And the Prophet told her to respond as follows: "My father is Aaron, and my uncle is Musa." The marriage led to a closer relationship between Muslims and Jews of Medina. And the last wife was Maimuna, a divorcee from another tribe. She was married twice and was 57 years old. The Prophet's uncle Abbas suggested he marry Maimuna so that he could bring her tribe into the fold of Islam, which eventually happened. So the important viewpoint here is to recognize that not only does Allah, love to create things in pairs. Those of us who are sheikhs and imams have given plenty of khutbahs about how the Quran mentions everything in pairs. But the Quran also creates men and women in pairs to set an example for the rest of us. So it is no surprise that luminary women are paired with prophets who are charged with such a noble task of spreading the message of God, so that together, with the help of a wife or help of a woman or help of a mother, the man who is the messenger, who is carrying the message forward, can be helped and aided so that Allah's message can be brought to humanity. And it all starts with the first couple. Without Eve, there would be no progeny. There would be no family, no community, no society. And then Allah also chooses to highlight women exemplars who in today's time would be shunned in our communities. They would be barred from our houses of worship, and they might even be killed for the type of women they were. Let us look at who these women are: a single mother, a mother out of wedlock, a barren woman, a separated woman, a widow, a divorced woman, a non-believer who's a perfect leader, and a sexual assaulter. Look at the way the Quran elaborates sexual aggression. Today we talk about Me Too, sexual aggression, and yet we have an entire story of Prophet Yusuf, who is a victim of sexual assault. In this case, he's being assaulted by a woman, Zulaykha, and becomes vulnerable to her sexual exploitation. and to approach this story from another angle as a narrative of what is commonly referred to as today's day sexual assault, we can gain insight into the dynamics of sex, political power, coercion, testimony, and pursuit of justice. Remember, Zuleika was the wife of the governor. And all the women, all her girlfriends knew what was going on, but they all kept silent. So this is a lesson that we draw from this story, not that a woman was a sexual assaulter, but how sexual assault, is aided and abetted by people who remain silent. And he languished in a prison on false charges. Of course, eventually the story winds up being a beautiful story because she accepts, her mistake, she's transformed, and he's freed. But the point is, there is a lesson to be learned from the story. So in conclusion, the Quran classifies many women beyond motherhood as role models for humankind, whose importance and work existed outside the role of strictly a mother. God willed many notable pious women to obtain social, spiritual, public freedoms outside of their role as mothers. And it set a precedent of divine will for generations of women to come. And there's an example of a woman that showed that motherhood is not the only requirement for a woman to be successful in worldly life or afterlife. Many of you know the story of Rabia al-Basri, who rejected materialism and accepted a life of poverty so she may embrace Allah fully. Her gratitude to Allah was so deep that no man could even compare. She rejected many marriages proposals by saying, God can give me all you offer and even double it. It does not please me to be distracted from him for a single moment, so farewell. So she would send away all these marriage proposals. And her life did not fit the pattern for women of her time. Instead, she retained full control and legal autonomy of herself. She was neither wife or a mother, nor was she under any male authority. Why am I stressing this story today? Because we have so many Muslim men who marry non-Muslim women. And we have so many Muslim women who remain single for the rest of their lives because they have been told that they only have to marry a Muslim man. And so what is a single woman to do with her time? And I know many of these single women who are devout, who are God-centric, who spend all their times on spiritual works. So I want them to know that, between Aisha, who never had a child, and somebody like Rabia Basri, there is an example. You can become an ambassador or the messenger of the messenger of the messenger. And so we do not have to frown upon women who have not experienced motherhood. So I am now going to conclude, and as times went by, women's role in society was diminished by powerful men and empires who held misogynistic views, views which slowly chipped away at women's rights, both within their religion and in their everyday life. I think by acknowledging the rights of women around the world, we can take an important step to unfold divine wisdom that can come through their voices and actions, as we have seen in the examples of the Quran and the Prophet's wives. Inshallah, I would like to make an announcement. In 2022, I will publish a book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women, which dives into the details of Quranic and historical support for Muslim women's rights to education, career, religion, testimony, marriage, divorce, all these rights classified according to the 6 objectives of Sharia: life, intellect, religion, dignity, family, and wealth. And I look forward to sharing the book with you and having a deep dive discussion, because one of the sheikhs mentioned that we really need to look at what each of these verses are saying. So I've spent a fair amount of time in elaborating and looking at all the sources and explaining things in as much detail as I possibly can. This is the jihad that I'm waging, and all of us need to wage collectively together so we can restore the true vision of the Quran. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, sister, for that presentation. You wonderfully articulated the Quran and focused and brought to our attention that the prophetic message was conveyed in pairs, right from Adam to our prophet, and it's so poignant point that you made, that if it wasn't for Hajra, we wouldn't be here. And why was Hajra chosen? I think that's certainly a point to reflect on. And the other point that you sort of talked about was Bibi Khadija. She was probably Jeff Bezos of our time, the female version. And yet, if it wasn't for her wealth, would Islam had flourished as it has? So I think these are all some of the points that we can now sort of dive into in the Q&A. But thank you so much for that presentation, and I hope you can stay with us for the Q&A. So what I propose we now do is, we are running a bit late since we started our program 15 minutes late. But let's see. Are there any questions on Menti, Adnan? What I'll do is that if there are any questions in the room, can we start taking some of those questions? Yes.
Firstly, thank you very much to all the speakers. Very much appreciated. And definitely, I'm never going to eat samosas the same way. I have a much more mindful appreciation when I eat a samosa now. As a result. On a more serious note, I think one of the things that I think about with this sort of thing is it's great to see the progressive view and taking forward of sort of maybe the contextual Quranic verses and beliefs, and being able to take them forward in time. But then I also see a risk with where maybe we, as a result, the risk around if we do basically take our own interpretation on things like verses based on the flavour of the theme of the time. So where and what is the perspective of how we basically temper the understanding, the tafsir, the ta'wil of the verses and the hadith in a way that is absolute and is towards truth versus, like I say, something that is a bit more badish at the time. Because sometimes that will take us into sort of progress, but at the same time there's obviously a risk of things being misinterpreted based on that context. Just how, if we rewind 300 years ago, we'll see some of our senior scholars have quite strange, well now seen as quite strange views that are obviously seen through a sort of very patriarchal view. But then how do we have a more absolute lens that is a bit more objective rather than sort of the subjective theme of society at the time? So I suppose that's a question for maybe all the different speakers. So I'm quite interested to hear the different viewpoints on
that. I will address that very quickly because I understand the question. As I've been writing my book, I've always been worried about not putting my opinion into it. And so really I try to go to the main source, which is the Quran. What does the Quran say? How has the verse been interpreted over time? What is the root meaning of the word? So for instance, in the case of polygamy, right? It went from go marry the mothers of the orphans or the orphan girls to go marry women. That's a very big shift because women in general was never mentioned. So this is why there is a confusion that, amongst men, because men actually think that they can marry 4 women. What they're being instructed to do is to marry, 4 women who have orphans, who are mothers of orphans. And so from my perspective, it is a charge to Muslim men today, as we are pretty much in a similar situation than we were at the time of the Prophet, where there are so many victims of war and conflict. And we have so many women fleeing places, and maybe the husbands have died, especially in places like Afghanistan. Muslim men today should just go to Afghanistan and take 4 women and marry them right there. This is what the Quran is instructing us. The Quran is not instructing us to, men to go marry 4 women. So these are the kinds of things that you learn from the hermeneutics as you go into who did this? Who made this verse this way? How was this changed? So this is the level of detail we have to get into to free ourselves from the shackles of the mistakes that have been made over time. And but it's what I've discovered.
Yeah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for a very interesting question. It's a very personal question. What is the limit and what is the extent of applying this approach? Hence the reason why you have this modern feminist approach to the Quran. Even though I disagree with, for example, Amina Wadud, her interpretation, her new hermeneutical approach to the Quran, with respect, I've written on it and I've written about her approach. We should be able to look at why she does that and how she does that. Within our principles of Islam, we have what we call, I was speaking to Sheikh Jaffar earlier on, and Sister Daisy has highlighted, which is called the higher objectives of the Sharia, the maqasid. So the maqasid are those higher objectives of the Sharia that protects certain objectives. And Dr. Robert Crane Dixon, he asserts that there's no limit on that. So originally there were 5, it went to 6, and nowadays Yusuf al-Qaradawi made 8 different higher objectives. For example, human rights is a fundamental premises that needs to be protected when applying Islamic jurisprudence in a modern society. So we should use it as a benchmark. All rulings should be based upon that foundational framework to address these issues. And then we have to be able to look at our ancient classical ai that wrote certain things which are not factual. So for example, we have An-Nawawi in our hadith literature. So An-Nawawi has a fatwa, a ruling that says that you cannot give organ operation or transplants. You cannot give it. Why? According to An-Nawawi, that this harms the body. That was the medical evidence at that time. However, in modern society, we know that's actually opposite. It has no premises now. So we have to reinterpret it in a modern context too. But we don't lose the value of the Quran or the foundational principles that our ai our ulama, our scholars, our rich, let me take that word away, our ulama and ai our rich history and heritage has put there in order to interpret the Quran and the prophetic way. So we do have that.
Thank you for the question. That brings up some important points. First of all, it's not necessary for everything to have a single objective answer. Islam, as we know, has some absolute principles and some areas of flexibility, which is why it's been able to spread to so many cultures and remain vitality throughout the centuries. There's sometimes an idea that gender roles need to be absolute and specified by the Sharia for all people, all times, but that's really ridiculous. The life of a nomadic tribe living on the plains somewhere 1,000 years ago, and the social role of men and women is going to be very different, or a farmer woman or a woman in the nuclear family in the 60s in the US. Women today, for example, in England have various social roles. So, I think we do ourselves a disservice to trying to prescribe a one-size-fits-all model on men or women, and a lot of times it just leads to a clash between what is presented as the ideal of Islam and then how people are actually living. Of course, there are certain principles that are absolute ethically and otherwise, and it is true that the fads of the time are always changing. There are, I think, a couple fallacies that sometimes it's easy for us to fall into, and by that I mean, the Muslim Ummah as a whole, maybe not individuals. One is that what is older is more authentic. A Mufassir in the 4th century Hijri is also being affected by the values of his or her time or culture. They're not all having the same values. Some scholars will point out that scholars in Al-Andalus oftentimes integrated different social values and expectations for gender roles than, say, in Muslim Iraq and so forth, or for that matter, Muslim Iran. So even back, in the olden days, there were ideas of the time, and so just because we're taking something from the classical era doesn't make it truer. It simply means it's part of the heritage that we have inherited. And while I respect the heritage, and I think it's good to respect the heritage, it doesn't mean we need to accept everything as the true blanket, perfect opinion for everything. The other thing is, I'd say for many Muslims, I'm not going to include every Muslim, but for many Muslims, there's sometimes the unstated idea that more restrictive is somehow more in line with the will of Allah or more pious. So, like with women, for example, if you find in a lot of cultures, if a woman is married to a religious scholar, sometimes she will dress, all in black, or in maybe more certain types of clothing which are perceived of as more conservative because this is seen as more pious. And for women, sometimes the end of the line, so to speak, as the most pious is to be completely invisible. And then you maybe have the full niqab and the, head chador or whatever. And then, maybe this kind of abaya. So it's like a sliding scale of less pious with the most absent and most restrictive. Suddenly being presented as the ideal, even though most of us will not, again, put that into words. So it's not necessarily that everyone is living like that, but the idea is that's how it should be. Whereas in the Quran, because I'm going to leave aside the complexity of other things, in the Quran, that isn't really presented as the number one ideal, or that simply being more harsher or more restrictive is more pleasing to Allah. Now, as for how to come to objective truth when discussing Islamic issues, first of all, I don't. It's difficult to say it can be completely done by a human being because we do all suffer from humanity. One thing I find that does help me personally to conceptualize these things is to try to frame things as the will of Allah as the creator of the universe and probably other universes and existences beyond us. I think that can sometimes put in perspective what, sorry to say, are sometimes a little bit silly discussions. I guess. One silly discussion I was told once is someone was very adamant that a Muslim woman who wears a sock that is not black is going to hell. This person was actually saying that, and they were making a religious case for that. It's not a normative view, but this was their view. And literally that was what it was, going to hell. But the point is, is Allah petty like that? Allah is going to, put us there in the Qiyamah, and what color was your sock? I mean, I'm not saying small or large things don't matter, but the things that matter in the Quran are not always what is perceived as being quote-unquote conservative. And so to try to reframe our orientation to a divine orientation, if you will, I think sometimes helps to add some maybe distance to the variety of things that circulate among human beings with all of our complexities. The other, of course, primary method being the analysis of the Holy Quran. And, we see from the diversity of tafsir that there usually isn't just one view for ayat, even with simple things like what is the subject of the sentence in all cases and so forth, or the exact meaning of the word. But to frame one's views in accordance with how we perceive the Holy Quran. One of the approaches taken in this era, especially with respect to social issues, including gender issues, is also the thematic use of the Quran. So not just word for word, a very sort of, putting a microscope on it implementation, but also taking into account the ethos of the Quran, and does a certain idea match the, the general sense of what one is perceiving from the text, which again, that there is a room for interpretation, and there's a room for error, but it's a way. And I think beyond that, prayer is a good thing. The moment we separate from that connection from Allah, and we rely on ourselves solely in terms of methodology or argument or whatever, without an attempt to reach out to the source of the revelation, then in a sense that is getting away from the point. I'm not going to say that Allah is always going to inspire us towards the truth, but that also inspires some humility, and I think also keeps us in the right frame of mind. I would say most ideas that I would, with all disrespect, consider to be ignorant do come from arrogance. Sometimes people's lack of knowledge about what they don't know. Among Muslims, sometimes that's not knowing there's a diversity of views on a topic, or between sects or interpretations or whatever, or about hadith, about tafsir, or just people's ego. I'm right, I'm going to be right, whatever it is. So those are some thoughts on it. It's the search for truth is a very challenging thing. Philosophers have been doing it for quite a long time, and theologians and colleagues and so forth. So, inshallah, may Allah help us. Thank you.
If you bring it from the other side. Are there any other questions? If you can bring this one around. It's okay. Any questions from the sisters? Okay. Any reflections? Yeah? Okay. You take this one. I think you just take this one. Go around. I think you'll just have to go.
Thank you. Really, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me. This has just been so enlightening, and the comparisons between what you've all said and my own faith, I'm Jewish, the fact that you're talking about what was revealed in the Quran, and I can compare that with what was revealed in the Torah, and that what you said about it's not about Islam, it's about Muslims, is just so much how I feel about it's not about Judaism, it's about Jews, and it's how we interpret and how we live our lives today based on what has been revealed to us, if that is your belief, in the past. You've given me so much to think about. I haven't got any specific questions, but it's just been absolutely fascinating and enlightening, and thank you very, very much.
I have it's not really a question, because I don't think you'll be able to fully answer it, because obviously you weren't there at the time. But one of the things that Sister said earlier was about the Quranic verse about when Lady Maryam brought Jesus back to the people, and the Quranic said that he pointed at him and he spoke. For me, how do you reconcile the fact that in that verse God has taken away Lady Maryam's voice as a female and given that to a male, and how do we then reconcile that with the current views that we're facing now?
Does anyone any of the panelists want to? I mean, do the sisters want to talk about agency here? I mean,
Yeah, okay, bismillah. Sorry, I'm searching as we speak. Bismillah. That's a good point and a good observation. here it is. It's in Surah Al Imran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You guys probably know what I'm looking for anyway. Well, let me address the issue there. I mean, the ayah, it doesn't necessarily forbid a woman from speaking. It's not that, you know, she's a female and she can't be speaking, or it's somehow shameful, because she's obviously like standing in front of the people and they're all looking at her, which is somewhat different to the idea of the voice as the aura. But rather, you know, it is a miraculous event, and also emphasizing the miraculous nature of Jesus, peace be upon him. But I think it's an interesting thing to consider. I mean, I would say that, going back to the portrayal issue, sometimes the way we do see women in how we tell of their lives is more as passive channels for things to go through them, if you will. Like a lot of the artwork and stories about Hazrat Fatima, peace be upon her, is not actually about her doing things, but sort of being a locus for things to be done. You know, whether it's some of the accounts towards the end of her life and so forth. Even though if we were actually to go through a biography and identify what she's done, you know, we'd be drawing pictures of her doing things in her daily life. So sometimes that idea is associated with women, but in any case, you know, there isn't any indication in the text that it is a prohibition on speaking. And I wanted to point out the Quran also has something similar with Nabi Zakaria, peace be upon him. Zakaria called on his Lord, saying, "My Lord, grant me from you a good child." You hear supplication, and then he says, "My Lord, grant me a sign that my prayer is accepted, and your sign is that you will not be able to speak to the people for 3 days, except by gesturing," which is what she does. So it's not actually gendered in this story, which is altogether, you know, she has her time when she has to be silent, and he has his time when he has to be silent. But I still think that's you know, it's a good thing to ponder on. And there we have one Quranic example showing that it is a balanced sort of thing.
I think it's a very good observation. But things have to take, you have to look at things within the context of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said and did such a thing. It's quite similar to the example of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam. Why would God leave him and order Ibrahim to just leave him in the middle of nowhere, in this eventual place which became Mecca? There was no water, there was no sustenance, no people, there was nothing. He just absolutely left him there. So some modernist interpretations of this shows how evil should be Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. But it's not about evilness, it's about the concept of your conviction to Allah. There's a certain message there which is showing that he's a prophet of Allah and he followed an order. So this incident of Sayyidah Maryam salamun alayha not speaking and Allah telling him to be silent isn't removing anything from her. It's to ignite and to show the extraordinary act of a child, a baby speaking, to show that this is the truth from Allah. So we have to take it in. It's not saying that all women should be silent and should not talk. In fact, some interpretations have used this within certain tafsir and have made a blender on it. But we should recognize that these are not role models only for females. They should be role models for everyone. For example, we have an incident in our history. Imam Shafi'i, one of the greatest scholars in the history of humanity, such a giant personality. When he went to Egypt, he left Baghdad and he went to Egypt. He reformulated his fiqh. His daily meeting was with a woman called Sayyidah Nafisa. who was the great granddaughter of Imam al-Hassan, Imam Hassan's great granddaughter. And he had such admiration for her, so much love and affection for her, that he would visit her and seek her advice. In fact, that when he was dying, when he was on his deathbed, Imam Shafi'i, to signify the greatness of a woman, said that when I die, make sure she prays over me. And that is when he died, they took the body of Imam Shafi'i outside the door of Sayyidina Nafisa. She came, she prayed, and she went back in. Showing the role of a woman, the scholarly role of a woman, the spiritual role of a woman. There's so much dimensions to it, and that should be inspiration not just to the women but to the males, or how much knowledge we take from our scholarly women. So we have to take everything in context. This is a very vast subject. Just on one presentation we can spend hours upon hours. However, what we need to understand is that we need to have dialogue, my brother. We have to be able to sit with people, even if they have a crazy view on the Quranic interpretation. We should be able to engage with them and debate with them and challenge them in a fruitful manner. And as our sister has just said, she's our sister of humanity, the comment she made, that reinforces that we are doing something good, alhamdulillah.
Okay, I think we're about 45 minutes from, sorry. There's a question from Sister Khadija there.
I don't think it's a question. I think it's like an observation. And I really, really, really struggle with it. Really, really struggle with the times we are in, with the oppression that a lot of us women go through. From, whether we are mothers, whether we're out there trying to work because we're mothers, because we're divorced without a choice in the matter, because we're married without a choice in the matter. I don't want to go on radio. And then when you have to go out, because you have to feed your children, you have to go out to work. And then when you go out to work, you're then again oppressed by men. And I'll say Muslim men, or who they call themselves Muslims, as Muslim women, because you're a Muslim woman doing this work. And I don't see it changing. I don't see the spaces in mosques opening for us. I don't see our voice being heard. I will say my voice is heard. I can say about Rasul and Qari Asam and this place, yeah. But I think I'm more heard by the white men that are my colleagues at work. And that is not a good way to be. I know women in Bradford, in an area in Bradford. I know women in Kirklees. I know women, I'm from Leeds, so I'm just speaking for myself here, where the men are supposed to be seen as superior, and women, they're allowed to go on loudspeakers and to 2,000 houses where they can call them sinners in 2021, because they wanted to keep their space, their community centre open for their women, so they could educate them, stop their children from being exploited. And then I've seen women who are so traumatized, they get really ill, they've got physically ill, and mentally not able to come out anymore because they've tried to do something good in the community, and they've been stopped because the men have bullied them. This is 2021, it's not however many years ago. It's not about interpretation of the balance of responsibility is 100% on the woman and 0% on the man in family situations. I have 4 children. I have brought them up by myself for the last 15 years. I've got my son married this year, but there was no responsibility taken from anyone else but me and my family. And then it carries on, because like I said, I try to go out to work and I'm thwarted in every way that I go. How is that going to change? Because I don't see the change happening. I see it as traumatizing, I see it as hurtful, I see it as difficult. But why from the Muslim men? And that's not me being a feminist, that's me saying I'm trying to make things better. I'm not here to make things worse for people. But some of the challenges when women are describing men as superior, I'm going to say I'm superior because I brought up those 4 children. I've gone to work. I still go home and cook and clean, and I look after their mental health, and I look after my own mental health, and I still try to care for my mum and my dad. And I work full time, sometimes 2 jobs. How is that? How does this work in this society? And I don't know who. I'm just saying it's a really good thing. I'm really happy that the school has done this, organised this today. But I know a lot of women that are in the similar situation that I am in.
Thank you. It's not being recorded. It's just so that we can hear you. So I'll send this mic to you. Yeah.
Thank you for organising, and thank you for your talks. It's kind of in relation to what she was saying. I think my question mainly is what is sort of practically, how can we change things? Because, I mean, as a woman, even though I appreciate everything you all said, as a woman I find it quite outrageous, upsetting, and quite frankly very insulting to sit and listen to, as in debate, the intelligence of a woman. I think is such ridiculous in 2021 that we're sitting here and talking about whether a woman is intelligent enough to be a witness, for example, or, you know, like her importance in society and trying to validate it. And just imagine if it was the other way around, when, you know, like you listen to loads of women telling men that they're, you know, you guys are smart and you're very important. And it can be quite patronizing. And I know that everyone means well, and I don't doubt that, but you know, I've been to mosques where I feel, you know, not welcome. I feel like I'm in the wrong place, and I'm anxious about whether I'm in the right place, being told to go somewhere else because this is a place that, you know, men aren't, even though it's the main entrance. Just things like that make women feel really unwelcome, like they don't want to go to the mosque. And like we are backwards as a society if we are debating these things should not be even the topic of debate, really. So how can we change? I mean, you talk about dialogue, but I feel like you're already talking to the converted, you're preaching to the converted, because all of us women know that we are intelligent and that we have a voice, but where are the men? Where are the men who need to listen to this? And like the male leaders in our community, I think there needs to be a dialogue between, like, you know, the male and female scholars in order to really make some real change. So how do we do that? I don't know if that's happening already or what, but how do we make a change from that kind of higher level, from the pulpit, to change people's views, you know, from a higher level, from top down, really, because we already know that we are important and significant in society and intelligent, and we don't need anyone to tell us that, really. But yeah, so I hope I didn't offend anyone. I didn't mean to. But thank you for your efforts. But just a little bit of insights from a female perspective, and I'm sure a lot of females would relate as well.
Thank you, sister, for all those observations. I'll give it to Sheikh. I think he wants to answer. I think he wants to answer. Just a point of clarification. The question of today's conference wasn't about the intelligence of women. The question of the conference was the women of Ahlulbayt and the relevance in today's patriarchal society. So there was no question about women's intelligence or anything on that accord. I think in one of the presentations, a reference was made about Islamic, where witnesses, where there's 2 against 1, 2 for 1, and perhaps the sheikhs can clarify that. But again, it's again in contextualizations, like the sheikh said, that we need to take some of these interpretation of some of these hadiths and Quranic verses from the Quran and contextualize them.
I'm saying clearly people think that
Yes. Okay, so practically, and I think this is probably. Are there any other observations or any other comments? Because I think we can probably end. Are there any questions?
I think I just want to add a point. Maybe.
Okay, so we'll add a point. And yeah.
Very briefly, I just thought I agree with the sister and everything, and brilliant speaker and everything. I feel that the oppression on women, if we can mention that, if we take the whole Islamic country's geography from Morocco to up to Iran, I think they're a little bit different as you go further into east, where we're from, Indo-Pak, 99% of us are from there. There, the culture takes over, and they mix it with the religion. I mean, for example, the oppression of women, and you can't marry again, and the sister was speaking, how she's treated. I can relate to that because the part of Pakistan I'm from, they're very, very traditional, and this is what happens there. And I think we mustn't mix the religion of Islam with the culture that we're from, especially Indo-Pak region. It is misogynist, and just want to encourage you that it's not Islam, it's the culture. So I just wanted to add that it's unfortunate, but that's what happens in the Pak region. Yeah.
Thank you, Brother Tariq, for that observation. I think as a closing statement, I think could we address as a practical closing statements, whether we look at the women of Ahlulbayt or whether we look at sacred women, how would we answer a question posed by the sister Kaniz there? Yeah. So should we start with you, Sheikh?
First of all, I want to thank everyone for staying so long at this program. I know everyone's tired, it's a Sunday. And I want to thank the organizer, Sheikh Jaffar, everyone, for putting this program together. Sister, I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I feel your pain because I was the Imam of one of the biggest masjids in Bradford, Madani Mosque in BD3, which has a congregation of over 5,000 to 6,000 people.
Exactly my point. Exactly my point.
So my telephone would never, the problems I saw, the spiritual abuse, the mental abuse, Allah help us. And we've got a long way to go. But we have to make a distinction between the religion and the culture, which I'm sure everyone agrees on. The issue isn't about talking about women, whether they're intelligent or not. The reason why I spoke about the issue of witnesses and these issues were because certain aspects of our community use this as premises to legitimize their views of women. So it's not about me saying women are not intelligent. I think that question itself is very insulting. For me, the greatest of all women is Sayyidah Tayyiba Abida Sajida Salam al-Aliyah, Sayyidah Fatima, the Prophet's honorable daughters, and Sayyidah Zaynab and Sayyidah Khadija and so forth. You mentioned about Sayyidah Khadija. She was, you made a comparison between her and Jeff. Let me add wealth-wise, obviously, but let me add you to one thing. In the history we have, Sayyidah Khadija was the richest of all women in the entire world. The only person that had more money than her was the ruler of Persia at that time, and she dedicated all to Rasulullah. I'm not going to say that this is the solution. We've got a lot. It's a very long journey, but we start with one step. And how does that step begin? By talking to each other, sitting with each other, challenging these problems. So if we have it in the community, challenge it. Challenge our leaders, sit with them, hold them accountable. We are not in Pakistan now where you can just put it underneath the carpet. Let me give you one more example, the grooming issue. Like we had it in Manchester, we had it in Rotherham. It's not a Muslim issue, but predominantly a lot of them were Muslims. But we have to address that Islam never said do these things. It was a cultural, and again, I wouldn't even call it culture because culture doesn't look at women in that way. That you abuse women, we would never thought that. But it's certain devilish individuals, males that don't have God-fearingness in them. But we have to be able to challenge that from the minbar. The imams should be speaking about groomings. The imams should be speaking about the problems in the community, not speaking about Imam al-Hussein or Abu Bakr and Umar and have no contextualization in the modern society. Look at the problems we're facing. This is just the tip of the iceberg. What about, when I was in Bradford as imam, the biggest call I used to have from our sisters, Allah help them, and they need help, is the mental health about abortion. The ratio of abortion in Bradford was unbelievable. Why? Because the issue has not been addressed by our leaders, by our ulama, and by our... So, I think we have to arrange more programs like this where we can talk, where people like you can be very honest. No one's mashallah, you brought 4 children up, mashallah, Allah reward you. Your reward is well, that's inspirational. But we have to take your example as a role model, how you dealt, what were the challenges, and come up with certain solutions. Like I'm not going to lie to you and say this is the solution. We are very far. Drugs issues in our communities, domestic violence. I'm talking as an imam dealing not with a small congregation. I'm speaking about 16,000 Muslims in the biggest area, the heap of Muslim activity in Bradford, where your average congregation is 5,000, 3,000 people, and domestic violence that's happening in our communities. Women running away from the home. We have a lot of problems, sister, but we have to start by speaking to each other. And I pray that this is the beginning of a very good endeavor. And by us speaking about these issues, by you being in the masjid now and openly speaking, I think this is a very positive thing. And I pray, inshallah, every masjid can use this. And we are seeing changes. Sorry for rattling on. We are seeing masajid are opening up now because they're being challenged. 50% of Pakistani Asian masajid that have no facility for women, they're being challenged now. And it's change. It's not happening enough, but it is happening. Change. Some change is happening. It will take time, but it's going to take time of not you and us, but we together. We have to change that us and you, and we have to come together to deal with the problem. These are just my observations. But again, I thank you, and I pray Allah gives you strength, and you are very inspirational to everyone, inshallah.
Thank you, Sheikh, for your closing remarks. I'll give it to Sister, and Sheikh just mentioned that, I think to your question, I think Sister has written an article about women.
Women are deficient in
Intellect, yeah. So perhaps she'll be able to answer your question directly.
The article's worth reading on its own, and there's probably a brief presentation on YouTube. Ooh, I'm getting up. Just Google it. You can look at the articles. I do argue against the textual authenticity of the narration. With all respect, I don't agree with your view that contextually women were less intelligent or aware back in the time of the Sahaba. I might be misunderstanding you. Okay. That's good, because sometimes people do argue that, well, in the modern era women are educated, so it's maybe not the same as it was back then. But some people argue that, and in my experience, when you go, for me at least, going places where people have a rougher life, I find women are very sharp, even if they can't read, they can't write, and back in the day there's no internet or whatever, but because the life is difficult, what's going on. People know about politics, and they know about corruption, they know about money, because, some societies women were not dealing with money, but the point is, the time of the Prophet and the society was a very rough life, and there's no indication, in my opinion, when you look at the hadith, that women are somehow saying stupid things. This is not what I discuss in my article, but they come across as very sharp, very involved, and you have to be, otherwise you're not going to survive in a society like that, and especially given that women are sometimes more disempowered, you have to be more alert to the dynamics of people, and the family and the tribe and everything else. So I misunderstood, but I'm pointing out, if someone were to say that, I think that's a fallacy, and I think it's actually the opposite. The comforts of modernity can sometimes tune down the brain for men and women. But you can check out the arguments in the article and see if it works for you. I mean, but to be honest, I wrote that based on a presentation I was asked to give, honestly. But I just deal with it personally. You know, I feel like actions speak louder than words. If I can act like I'm using my brain, that proves more that women have intellect than, you know, 1,000 times just saying it. But I agree that's an issue. With respect to what you said, I think that really points to the importance of dialogue and being able to hear what goes on in people's lives in real life. You know, as they say, unfortunately, out of sight, out of mind, and the reality is in our communities, a lot of times the experiences of women are not heard. You know, they're not heard, they're not validated, or they're treated as an exception. And I'm sure sometimes it's infuriating when, for example, you hear someone from the minbar saying women don't have to work in Islam, women are taken care of, and that's why, you know, Muslim women have a better deal than Western women. And, you know, you're sitting there going to work and with all these responsibilities and, you know, trying to keep yourself together. And some people, you know, they'll sort of dismiss that and say, well, that's not, you know, the ideal. But of course, the reality that most people live is not generally the ideal. And I think, you know, but like I said, the solution is having more open dialogue. To some degree, I think, you know, personally that the advent of the internet and satellite TV has opened up a little more dialogue for men and women sharing their experiences and perspectives. Don't want to leave you guys out. I know there's tough things about being a man and there's tough things about being a woman. But I think that's probably the only real way forward. As for what you're saying, you know, that goes back, you know, to what I was saying, that a lot of things, unfortunately, that are circulated in the world, including the Muslim community, that are ignorant, is arrogance, egotism, people not knowing what they don't know, and that's either the nafs or shaitan. You know, to be blunt, those are the tools of shaitan, and those are the dangers of the nafs. But people don't realize, you know, the worst hole you dig for yourself is when you are unjust to someone or oppress someone in the name of religion or in the name of God, in the name of the sacred. And to be honest, I get very angry if I hear someone from the minbar say something that might encourage social injustice. Maybe they're saying it by accident. That's an even bigger hole in hell as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, it does happen, and I can sympathize with your views. With respect to this sort of thing we're talking about, I do think there's still a value to saying it, because I have to admit, some of these things, you know, we've heard them so much, they become a little bit canned sometimes. Like, oh, Hazrat Fatima was very involved in the Muslim community, and Bibi Maryam is such a good example. But at the same time, if we weren't saying them, then they wouldn't become ideas that people are familiar with at all. So I think there's a virtue to presenting them, especially, you know, because like my generation, I think sort of these ideas became normalized, and maybe they will continue to become normalized, while at the same time it's not the end. And you know, I do think, again, sometimes too much theorization and not actually getting into people's lives isn't going to solve every problem, but it is one part of the picture. But yeah, I do think dialogue and being able to share and hear experiences openly and without stigmatizing is important. I do have to say, unfortunately, when I was thinking about the Me Too situation, you know, despite the fact that many Muslim women did come forward, there's lots who won't because they're afraid to. And we know why. It doesn't mean these things don't happen, but, you know, we've still got that out of sight, out of mind little bit situation. Inshallah, it can get better. There's more that could be said, I suppose, on these topics, but, you know, they're big topics, and inshallah, you can continue them.
Thank you, Sister, for your closing remarks. I think you've acknowledged it was a misunderstanding. I think Sheikh was referring to this business transaction on this hadith, and it was very specific. So I think that's clarified. I'll give it across to Sheikh Jaffar for his closing remarks.
Sister Huda had a hand up. I just want to ask.
No, I just wanted to make a comment. I just wanted to say my humble opinion. I think it's the role of the people in positions of high leadership within the community to advocate for the woman and her rights rather than the woman who is in a difficult situation. She should have to bear her pain to everyone just to make everyone understand the responsibility isn't on the woman. The responsibility is on the woman, in my opinion. And so I feel like I get frustrated that hasn't changed anything. Men have to be advocating for women now in men's circles. Look at today's program. How many men are there? And the men are the ones present. I don't think they're the ones that need to hear this. It's the ones that aren't present usually most of the time. So in events or gatherings where there's a large turnout, is anything being done to advocate for the rights of the woman? And simple things. A woman doesn't have to be in a very bad position for her to be advocated for. There are simple things like their involvement in child upbringing, in the home, in housework. It starts from small things and then it goes up. And I just feel like the onus is always being put on the woman to fix things, and that's I don't think that's right or fair or just. I think men need to do more, and men have to step up. Yes.
The balance of power, unfortunately, is with the men.
Not in my house. Not in my house.
When you're standing in a masjid, in a mosque, thousands of men that you're preaching to, then the balance of power is with you.
I agree.
In another city, and I was taking my daughter down to her father. First of all, the women's section in that mosque was a small storeroom, and the mosque was empty, but there was a 6-year-old boy tailing me and incredibly frustrated with me because I was walking in this empty mosque to the men's section. I found that I gave that young boy the benefit of the doubt, but that boy's seen and heard things at the age of 6 that's made him feel the need to walk after me, walk with me wherever I went from that point onwards to make sure I stay in the right place. Where does that come from? What has that young boy been taught from such a young age that he feels the need to do this? I hope it was something very innocent and just I laughed it off at the time, but it stayed with me because I thought, if he's doing this from the age of 6, what's going to happen when he's older? And the mosque was empty, there was no one there, it was just us.
Thank you, sister, for those observations.
Sorry, Russell, I've just got one point.
We'll need to finish. So make it quick.
Two very quick. Is there, so we have these programs all the time, you know, up and down the country, every day, every week. There's always a program I see every month on Facebook or Twitter and Instagram about role of women. What's being done next? I mean, we've got 2 respected sheikhs here who are very well known, one in Bradford, one in Leeds. What's being done next to continue the discussion?
Thank you, sister. I'll give it to Sheikh just for his final comments. I think that the point that has been made is dialogue. Sisters, if you're not happy with things that are not happening within your centers, you need to basically go to the management and speak to them about them.
Have you tried that?
No.
Have you tried it?
Yeah, it's difficult. But if there's any issues as far as the Baab is concerned, I'm sure you can come to me or any of the committee members, and we'll certainly take those points on. I think we're not in a perfect society. There's more we can do, much more we can do. But I think what we've done today is we've used the birth anniversary of Lady Zaynab, who's suffered. We can't sort of comprehend her suffering, and used that to have this event. Like Sheikh said, we may not be able to come up and give you answers. I think what it is we've the conference is basically aimed to highlight these issues in a setting of a mosque setting.
30 seconds.
Sure.
Just one intervention.
Sure.
Sorry for that. Just one intervention which I've just remembered is the Muslim Council of Britain, who represents a large amount of masajids in the UK. They have engaged on a new initiative, which is a 6-month training program to train females in regards to leading roles in the masjids. It's a step. You may not agree with it.
We don't need to be trained, honestly.
We all need training. We all need.
Really are listening out there. So they've done that, but actually we don't need to be trained.
But let me make my point, sister. So the training is by leading female scholars and experts to share with each other what management skills we need, how to tackle certain issues in the masjid, how to do certain things, and that is one intervention that's taken place, alhamdulillah. You may not agree with it, but I think it's a positive thing. I think it's a positive thing. I think the journey will never end. There is a lot of problems we have in our community, but we should acknowledge that there's one step of one organization doing it, and we in all of our roles. Again with the sister, I don't think it's just the sister's role, it's everyone's role to advocate goodness and cooperation between everyone. I think it's a long conversation.
Can I just sort of like reply to that? Simply because when you go to those mosques, if those mosques, the men in those mosques don't have those open minds and not interested in the woman's opinion and not interested in open those doors for them, shut those doors on those women. What are those? Doesn't matter what training you've got, those men's minds are closed.
The 25 masjids, sorry, the 25 females that have enrolled in the program, 25 masjids have agreed to fulfill the training and put them in a position of power. So it's been a joint, listen to my point. So it's not just a theoretical thing. The masjids are willing to take the female that learn this training and then give them the role, the position and power to make real decisions which previously were only with males. So it's a start. It's 25. It's less. We need many massages, but it is a start.
What she means, like, I think the way of man thinking that needs to be changed.
It's not man. It's female led.
Yeah, no, but
it's all the
I think,
females.
I think, Sheikh, like you said, it's such a wide subject that it's not. It's a subject which has so much elements to it. We won't. Let's have a private conversation. And perhaps. You can talk with Sister inshallah. Sheikh. Over to you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. No pressure on me to summarize at all. I'm going to humbly disagree with the Sheikh and say I don't believe that dialogue is the way at the moment. As in, to present that as the starting point. I am drawn by two comments that both of our sister participants, the panelists, mentioned. Sister Daisy said at the conclusion of her presentation, "This is my jihad." Look at the words that she's using. This is my jihad. And then she invited us to participate as a collective in that jihad. Sister Amina mentioned, and she wanted to raise a point, and then she said, "with all due disrespect." I don't know if you caught that. She made a point, she prefaced it with all due disrespect. And then I was intrigued when Sister at the back wanted to raise this issue. I don't think we should still be talking about whether women, are at par of men and everything. And then she apologized for some reason and said, "I hope I didn't offend any of you." Yeah? Drawing on these 3 points, and I hope the Sheikh doesn't mind me saying, drawing on those 2 comments and then the sister's point, I think we should start with a bit of offense. I think it's long overdue. I think we should be a bit offensive when needed. And what I mean by offensive, I don't mean it as in swearing, I don't mean bad akhlaq. What I mean is that if you note my presentation, I suggested that the Quran and Sunnah did not tolerate ignorance, backwardsness, and exploitation. It did not tolerate it. The challenge we have with my noble sister who's been leading the community for decades here, and I'm a guest in this region compared to her presence, her eternal presence here, we have to, when thinking about reform in this area, divide it into 2 spaces. There is the cultural problems, and then there is the Islamic interpretational problems. So when my teacher here asked, how do we ensure that we go forward in a progressive way without crossing boundaries, we do need to divide the conversation and ask, what is the difference between cultural practices that are happening in mosques versus fiqhi interpretation that may be 100 years behind the waqi', the reality. Sayyid al-Khou'i, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, the giant of his era, 30 years ago, writes that a woman cannot become a marja, the highest authority in Shi'i Islam, by virtue of there being no dhawq. It's not the taste of the religion. Can you see the problem? If a person is born in the 1920s and then is interpreting the religion in accordance with his or her waqi' and what he or she has the taste, now he has an ultimate judgment on what the taste of the religion is. But I'm not here to give deference. I'm criticizing at a scholarly level. This is not sufficient anymore. So then I am drawn to the point from Sister Huda and my own wife, my teacher here, who told me that what we need men to lead. I agree, and I'm reiterating that. We need men to lead. And we also need women not to tear each other down. That when women move forward in these spaces, women cannot tear each other down. Women need to support one another to push them to the higher echelons. So, I conclude with this. Number one, that the community should be at war with backwardsness and oppression and manipulation wherever it may be. That is the religion of Islam. That is the Quranic and prophetic model. Number two, it should be men that lead it, not men that are trying to reduce religion to cultural practices. And number three, let women assist women in their development. If we can move with these 3 points, then I feel we will be in the right direction, inshallah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.
Can I just add one last thing?
Hassan.
I need to say it because women in my circles, we don't tear each other down. We all lift each other, and the thing that language that we use is lift as we rise. So I think that's another generalization that's just being made about us.
No, not a generalization. An encouragement.
We don't tear each other down. Honestly, we really do lift each other. And if it wasn't for those women, I wouldn't be able to speak so confidently here.
Thank you, sister, for that. Thank you, our panelists, for traveling all the way from London and from Manchester and joining us. It's always a pleasure and it's an honor to have you both at this center. And unfortunately, Sister Daisy had to leave, but she did say that she's publishing a book very soon. Perhaps I think the next event we can do is actually have a book club where we actually read the book and perhaps invite her in and have a discussion, something on that. I think that would be good. And thank you, the audience, for coming. A bit disappointed at the level of the turnout. I think, like one of the sisters made a mention that those who haven't attended, they should have been here. So I hope that message goes out. And I think, again, what the sister, I think, Anis, that you mentioned, that you uplift each other, and we should have seen more ladies here today, asking for programs like these, because, until we don't hear from you that, I take your point that, we need to lead, and we have led, and to organize a program like this, but we need more sisters to engage and to advise us that this is what they want, I'm only speaking as far as the Baab-Ul-Ilm is concerned. We're a family, a small community, but you come and tell us what you want, and we'll facilitate that for you. With that, thank you so much, and inshallah, there's snacks outside, and there's it's not karak chai, it's doodh patti, isn't it? Sorry, pink. Oh, it's pink chai. So it's pink chai with some snacks. So please collect that. Yeah, it's a freshly made stuff. It's not the chai wala stuff. It's a chai stuff. With that, thank you so much, and God bless you all.